Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Survived the Final Battle? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. The one who gives and takes away. The one who is the ultimate creator, and yet the most merciless villain to those who wish to run away from. Or perhaps run towards it. The ultimate goal is hidden in the mists of time. A firm hold on reality leaves its captives trapped with the unchangeable results of their conduct. For as long as Izuku's memory could reach, he wished to become the #1 hero, save lives of those who could not protect themselves and save those who were in danger. The videos of All Might coming to the rescue of so many civilians and citizens, that shiver that lonely build-up with time. Unfortunately, this was not what he wanted. He did not want to be the one with everyone's blood on his hands. He wasn't supposed to become a hero at the cost of the lives of everyone he held dear in his heart. The understanding slowly setting in that reality was darker, colder. He wasn't supposed to get a quirk in the first place. He wasn't supposed to become a hero at the cost of the lives of his friends. He should have never been the sole survivor. It's been a few months since the final battle between the League of Villains and the heroes, the battle that forever shook the lives of civilians and left a scar on the people. The horror of chaos and violence was an event which left many scarred, Izuku realizing that becoming a hero was more than just wearing a costume and earning a fan club. The worst part, he didn't even know what happened. One minute he was fighting, and the next he was laying on the ground, his body bruised, bones broken and fractured, never experiencing such uncomfortable pain in his life. His hero costume was almost ripped to shreds, half of his sleeve torn off, as well as his mask. It was a miracle he was still able to walk. His vision was barely clear as he limped, his head throbbed, looking around the battlefield. His classmates, all of his classmates, and the villains could not be spared as they all laid on the ground, dead. Ochako's body was lying on the ground, unmoving. But as Izuku ran up to her and grabbed her frail shoulder, to look at her face his eyes widened in horror. Turning her over, he looked at the fractured face, or at least the remnants of it. Half of her skin was torn off, presenting the flesh underneath. A leaking eyeball, the dried-up blood dripping down the wound of the lifeless girl, mud sticking to it. His lungs felt as if they had shrunk, like a tight grip was squeezing his chest as he walked around, coming from one classmate to another, his body trembling and his attempts to hold hope disappearing away. Bakuga's body was nearby, a deep cut along his neck. Blood poured down his neck, his eyes hollow, holding no more life in them. No one was left unscarred, nearly all missed their limbs, torn as if they had been paper. His friends were gone. Deku remembered how he let out a loud cry to the heavens, confirming that he was the only one still breathing. He had no idea how he deserved this great pain. The families of the fallen ones have not recovered, mourning and crying after their children have sacrificed everything to save the world. Parents and siblings holding each other as they desperately tried to find the remains of their loved ones. Izuku's chest hurt simply from the image of Mitsuki as she held tightly onto the dead body of her son. Weeks have passed, and yet no one that was touched by the fight had recovered mentally from it. And though the crime went down, and unfortunately so have the letters to the UA Academy, people wanting to be heroes had become a dream. People no longer want to follow their fantasies, everybody wanted security and safety. In everyday lives, individuals often hid their quirks, either using them for personal gain or avoiding them altogether. Some even hid their quirks, fearing reflections on past events, enhancing their overall experience. Heroes weren't needed anymore. Izuku himself had now been doing part-time jobs, working as either a builder or a social worker, aiding people who had been hurt during the battle, or trying to rebuild a new place that had been destroyed. He had stopped using his quirk, almost forgetting what it was like to feel like a hero. And every day has been the same since then. He would wake up early in the morning, get ready, go to work, have a small lunch during the day, come back from work, exchange a few words with his mother, take a shower and go to sleep, only to repeat the whole process of the next day. He did not have anything to look forward to. Not anymore. But perhaps not all was lost. Izuku was requested to assist a new intern in mixing some concrete one day while he was working at the construction site. Tom Taylor's was the young boy's name. Slender and scrawny, he was a little younger than Izuku, with dark amber eyes and pitch black hair. A few days before the war, he moved from America, and regrettably, he was among the victims who had lost his parents as a result of the turmoil and devastation that ensued. The green-haired male felt sorry for the youngster because he understood the impact that loss might have. During their lunch break, they started talking about their hopes for this dystopian world. And upon hearing Tom's answer, Izuku felt his whole entire world come to a stop. With my quirk, I can manipulate time and help someone go back in order to change in the future, so hopefully one day I'll find someone who will be able to fix this mess. The ex-hero felt as if an answer was laid out on a silver platter before him. He looked at the blackhead male before smiling widely. You mean, you can help me fix everything? And bring everyone back? At first Midoriya felt like she was in a beautiful dream, before the cold wind of harsh reality brought him back to reality. He could actually fix this. Currently, Izuku lay down on a flat surface at the abandoned building that Tom found. He listened to the blackhead male as he explained to him the whole entire process of his ability and what his limitations were. Now listen to me carefully, as this will determine whether you will be able to save everyone and make sure that no consequences of the present are going to impact the past, he began. First of all, when I bring you back to the past, you will be aware of what has happened in the present. Your current mind will be stuck in the body of your past self, however slight alterations will begin to happen. Nothing serious, however. Don't be surprised when once you look in the mirror you're going to see some physical changes, such as a scar on your face or perhaps a different hair color, or maybe even a mole. Izuku nodded. It seemed simple enough. Second of all, you and I will be able to contact each other only 5 times and only 5. Whenever you look in a mirror or a puddle or whatever, something reflective, you will be able to see me and hear my voice. However, you must know, after you contact me for the last time, you will either be able to come back to the present, or go back in time and be stuck in that reality forever. Tom kept on explaining as he looked sternly at the hero. The blackhead fiddled with his hands as he looked down. And now for the most important rule: nobody, and I mean nobody, must know that you're time traveling, or that they had died or how they died. The green-haired was surprised as he looked at the black-haired male, confused. Why not? Unfortunately, I am not quite sure why, but you mustn't let anyone from the past know. Otherwise, they will cease to exist. Izuku's heart sank at the words as he felt his chest get heavier with each breath. Tom continued, and if that does happen, no matter how many times you will go back in the past, their existence will be wiped out from their reality forever. Izuku knew that what he was about to do was dangerous and probably absurd. But the death of his friends had weighed on his soul. He wished for nothing else were to be able to reverse what happened. This was his only chance, and he was not going to waste the opportunity. Izuku looked at the ceiling, determined more than anything. I'm ready. Tom sighed as he looked at the hero pitifully. This wasn't his first time doing this. The blackhead male began as he placed his hand on top of Izuku's forehead before their eyes met. Promise me that when you succeed, you will meet me again. To that Izuku smiled wisely and nodded, of course, my friend, and with those words he closed his eyes as he felt his soul being sunk into his own body before suddenly feeling as if his whole entire existence was being shredded into pieces and slowly driven up on the slow mist of the void. It wasn't painful, and it definitely was not uncomfortable. They actually felt quite pleasant. Until his feet hurt. He opened his eyes to look down at them only to realize that he was wearing once again the red shoes that he had been wearing to school every day. He was confused at first. They were broken during the fight. His eyes widened as he looked around, noticing that he was once again standing at the entrance to the UA Academy. He looked at his hands as he smiled widely, noticing that there was not a single scar from the time traveling. He was back. He could fix everything. Izuku's mind was going through so many emotions as the realization sunk into him. The opportunity in front of him was overwhelming, and yet he hadn't felt such happiness in so long. He was going to fix everything. Make sure everyone would stay alive. Deku had to take a deep breath at first, calming down his pounding heart. His own breathing felt icy for a moment. The male reached out to his back pocket, a sigh of relief escaping him as his hand grabbed his phone and turned it on to see where, or when he was exactly. March 12th. That's weird, he thought to himself as his eyes were plastered to the phone screen, confused. Wasn't this the date the sports festival ended? His memories felt distant, a constant fog clouding the recollection of events which for some reason left Deku feeling isolated. But the more thought he put to it, the more questions seemed to rise up, further making the green-haired male consider trying to contact Tom. On one hand, he knew he should only keep contact in cases of emergencies or necessities, but on the other hand he felt more lost than before traveling between time. Perhaps it would be a good idea to have a look around first. Deku! Izuku felt his breathing stop as the familiar voice reached his ears. A smile formed on his face upon understanding who this was. He missed her. Uraraka, I'm so happy to dash, his voice dropped when he turned around to see his friend. However, rather than expecting to see a cheerful smile, brown joyful eyes of the bubbly friend that supported him, he saw something he wished to forever erase out of his mind. Here she was, half of her face missing, the flesh and muscle bleeding down to her neck. The leaking eyeball now had little bits of mud and broken pieces of glass sticking into her skull as somehow she was nonchalantly running towards Izuku. Her expression was lifeless, and yet her body language and her voice did not indicate as such. Deku stood frozen to the core, the hair on his body stool still as he could barely comprehend what was happening. His breathing picked up to a point he felt his diaphragm hurt, his vision getting darker the closer Uraraka approached. However, something in her behavior seemed to change as her pace slowed down, her head tilting a little to the side as her hand slowly reached out. Deku? Is everything okay? But before Uraraka could take another step closer, Izuku turned on his heel and ran away from the girl in fear and doubt. His heart pounded as he ran into the academy, bumping into the other students which crossed his path. He had no idea where he was running. All the sounds from around him mashed into one inaudible pitch which was overwritten by his own heartbeat, banging in his ears like a loud drum which could not be stopped. He stumbled upon accidentally bumping into something, only to look back and hear another familiar voice. Watch it, oh Midoriya. It was the almost monotonous voice of Jiru, who almost did not recognize the green-haired male. You dyed your hair? She asked, taking a step closer to the male, wanting to see if he was all right. Izuku felt as if his heart went up his throat once his eyes averted to Jiru, seeing her nose completely shattered and deformed, blood splattered all over her cheek and her bottom lip. Her hero costume was bloody as a large chunk of her stomach was missing, displaying the large and small intestine which dangled down like a bloody chain near her legs. His blood pumped through his body so quickly, he could almost feel every single blood cell as it ran through his veins, his heart aching painfully at the sight of his classmate in the state he saw her, lying on the battleground. He no longer had the control of his body as he ran once again to the disabled toilet, quickly slamming the door and with shaky hands locking himself inside the claustrophobic room. With every breath, he felt his heart beating inside his ears, shutting off any sounds coming from the outside. His blood ran cold, his head hurt as he leaned his forehead against the cold wall, his eyes shut tightly as he desperately tried to calm down his breathing and heart rate. The images of his dead friends flashed before his eyes, each second becoming a torture of its own. Izuku experienced his own personal purgatory before stepping right into the gates of hell, engulfing and torturing him with every glance he took of his now alive and yet disformed friends. His hands were still holding the doorknob, his knuckles turning white as he tried to calm his breathing down. Then out. Slowly. He placed his shaking hand on his chest, right where his heart was, as if to check if it was still there. Finally, after what appeared like an eternity, Deku managed to open his eyes and turn around so his back could lean against the cold wall of the room. His heart rate started to calm down, his breathing turned slower and the air in his lungs entered and exited. Izuku's mind may not have been as clear as he wished it was, but he was sure of one thing for now. He needed to contact Tom and find out what was happening to him and the timeline. As his mind finally cleared up, the male stood up on his feet and walked towards the mirror that was right in front of him. He leaned against the sink beneath, his eyes never leaving his own reflection in the mirror. Only now he had realized that his hair was darker, a lot darker than before. It wasn't pitch black, and yet it wasn't his usual green color either. Not to mention that it seemed to grow a few inches. Now Deku could confirm that he had a bangs that could almost cover his whole vision, which explained why he could barely make out anything when he ran to the toilet. Izuku's reflection began changing, however, the glass beginning to crack in the corners, with a neat line breaking right in the middle of the surface. Soon, the male's reflection disappeared in a mist, replaced by the worried look of the black-haired boy in the abandoned building. Tom's face lit up at the sight of Izuku, his smile widening, knowing that his quirk worked without complications. Izuku, I was so worried your body disappeared, which is normal by the way. It always happens when I use my quirk on someone. But I didn't hear from you for a good 20 minutes. I was worried I didn't explain it well enough or something. The male smiled awkwardly as his eyes seemed to wander a little, trying to perhaps take a peek of Izuku's whereabouts. His eyebrows furrowed as he noticed the worn-out expression of the ex-hero, well, now not yet certified hero. Nice hair. Tom, why do all of them look exactly like I saw them on the battlefield? There was still a lump in his throat, his eyes meeting the gray orbs of the boy who sent him to the past. Tom thought for a moment, his hand brought to his face as he scratched his face. He took a deep breath before he started presenting his perspective. Perhaps, is it to do with your mental state? Your mind is aware of what happens in the future, so maybe your brain is simply not allowing you to see others as healthy and safe. Like a mental reminder. Izuku, I'm sorry. Tom's voice dropped, guilt evident on his face as he realized that there was still crucial information which he had not shared with the time traveler. Deku took a deep breath, this time to calm down his raging thoughts, the blood traveling through his veins as his fingers stretched and dug into the sink in front of him. What if I went back in time again? Before I started training with All Might, before I got my quirk from him, before I met everyone. Izuku, did you not hear me? It's not to do with the time at which you have arrived, it's the state of your mind. Look, I'm no therapist, and I am not good at giving others advice, the black-haired male began, staring at the male with sympathy in his eyes and desperation in his voice. But maybe the reason you see them like this isn't only because you want to save them so desperately? The hero looked into the mirror, confused with the words of the American male, his eyebrows furrowing in confusion and frustration. Tom sighed, fidgeting with his fingers as his eyes advertised downward, trying to once again piece his words together in a logical order. What I meant is, how did they die? Midoriya almost felt offended. Wasn't this obvious? The destruction was known worldwide. The news have not stopped spreading the information about the donations and the strikes going towards all the families who lost their loved ones during the battle. But even if he felt confused with the question, those words rang in his mind like a bell. Because in a way, Tom was correct. How did everyone die? Izuku's memory was still foggy when he brought his mind back to that place. The male shook his head, his hand quickly grabbing the faucet and letting the cold water down. His hands caught some of the water as he quickly washed his face, wanting nothing more than to ground himself. That could potentially help him focus. You said I can only contact you 5 times, right? How do I go back in time if I cannot contact you, and in case of an emergency? Deku knew he needed to be strategic, and needed to think about his main objective. Keeping everyone alive. Tom nodded, understanding as he straightened his back, explaining everything once more. On your phone, if you look at the side of the case, there is a button which is standing out from the rest. Usually it depends on the individual how it looks and where it is positioned. All you have to do is just press the button and soon you will find yourself in the initial place of arriving for the first time. Izuku followed the instructions provided by Tom, staring at his phone and noticing a small circular button on the side of the case, directly next to the sound button. Luckily, it didn't appear to be a built-in button, so it was easy to grab and press without any difficulties. And please, remember, do not let anyone know you're time traveling, and be careful. Without even a proper goodbye, Izuku turned around and left the disabled toilet. He could only hear a faint sound, possibly the communication portal disappearing from the reflection. His mind was only focused on one objective: ensure everyone survives the final battle, no matter the cost. Even if it meant he had to use more drastic measures. Izuku's face hardened as he walked towards the classroom of 1A. His eyes looked mainly at the floor beneath him as each of his steps felt longer and slower, even if he had kept the same pace. So was this it? He had to now make sure everyone survived at the end of the battle so he would never have to see them in their most gory state? He felt his stomach twist at the simple thought of having to look up at everyone as soon as his foot set inside the classroom. When the door creaked open, he could still hear the sound of chatting and snickering coming from his classmates. A sound he missed so dearly. However, his eyes still remained on the floor as his feet dragged him to his desk, his breath shaking every so often as he felt someone else's presence nearby. It felt so strange, horrifying. The others noticed Deku's strange, concerning behavior. How he seemed to look at everyone with such fear and run away at the sight of others. Perhaps he was tired? Maybe he felt sick? But even then, Midoriya was always known for being a kind individual, even if he was drained from all his energy. It was almost as if someone else pretended to be him, as if this wasn't the Deku who promised to become the #1 hero. Ochako sat only a few seats away from Izuku, her head leaning against her hand as she stared at him in concern and curiosity. She thought back to the moment when she greeted him in the morning only to be met with the male running away like burned. She stood near the gates, her body paralyzed from confusion when watching her friend run away from her. Her mind raced with thoughts and questions, trying to justify his behavior. Had she said something wrong? Did she do something to him? She didn't recall saying anything to him out of spite or even hateful. She was always nice to him, supportive of all of her friends. Then why did he react like this? Uravity sighed again, her eyes fixated on the darker and longer hair of her friend. She was so deep in thought she did not even hear her extroverted friend lean over, her chair creaking as her weight was shifted onto one side. Mina firstly observed Deku, but then her eyes averted towards the brunette with a wide grin. "Watching your crush?" she teased, her voice lower than usual, watching the reaction of Ochako. Uraraka, however, looked at the pink-skinned girl with a confused expression, her head turning towards her friend as her back straightened. "My crush? I'm just looking at Deku," she shrugged nonchalantly, wanting to appear unfazed. It was true, when Deku and Ochako first met, the female developed a crush on the boy. She admired him a lot and had to admit, his freckles were cute. However, with time she might have realized that what she felt wasn't exactly romantic attraction. More of an admiration which motivated her to be a better fighter too. Unfortunately, it seemed that Mina still believed that Uravity had a thing for Deku. And Ochako hoped that only she was the one to know this information. She quickly shook her head, shifting the focus. "Don't you think he's a little different than usual?" she asked, her eyes once again gazing towards the soft black-haired male, still not used to his hair color change. Mina shrugged, sitting properly in her chair as she stretched and laid her head on top of the table, boredom evident through her whole body language. "Maybe he's in his emo phase?" Jiraiya mentioned that he ran away from her as soon as she asked if he needed any help, she whispered, her hand covering a half of her mouth just to make sure that only the brunette heard her. Ochako's brows furrowed in confusion, however she felt a sense of slight relief wash over her. So it wasn't just her, but it still didn't explain Izuku's strange behavior. When Mr. Aizawa finally walked into the classroom, his eyes stopped to look at Midoriya, slightly confused as he noticed his student looked different. And yet, he seemed to shrug the thought off as he turned around sleepy and started getting on with the lecture. Izuku had a hard time concentrating, no matter how hard he had tried to focus on the lesson. His eyes barely managed to follow the teacher, who, unlike everyone else, looked the least distorted. Unfortunately, even the change of clothing did not save the man from being strangled by his own scarf. His face was pale gray as his eyes were dark red with veins popping out around the eyes and his hair ripped out from several places. The dark-haired male tried his best to look away from all of his classmates, trying to ignore the horrifying images in front of his eyes along with the flashbacks which appeared whenever a voice he recognized appeared. Even Bakugo stared at Deku with a side eye, although perhaps a flash of concern sparked in his eyes. The blonde-haired male rubbed his hand on his leg, getting rid of the sweat on his palm as he picked up the same pen again. Even if he knew the broccoli head, the longest of the people surrounding him, Bakugo never saw Midoriya in such a state before. So, he awake and yet hadn't slept in weeks. Eventually the torture came to an end, and the lesson ended. As Aizawa-sensei finally dismissed the students, no one in class expected Deku himself to grab his phone with such speed and make it to the door. In such a short span he was gone, leaving no trace of him. Ochako blinked a couple of times, before a determined look on her face appeared. Her hands reached for her thighs, gripping her belongings as she walked through the door. Her head turned as she looked out for her friend, and increased her pace as she saw him practically running away from the classroom. Deku! Uravity called out the name of the hero, not giving up as she wanted nothing but to find out what the male was going through. She noticed how Izuku tensed up when hearing her call out his name, and yet he did not budge or even turn his head to hear her better. She had to take deeper breaths when she reached him, only realizing that this little chase exhausted her more than it should have. She leaned forward a little, her hands on her knees as she leaned forward, taking a deep breath and smiling awkwardly, though the male still was facing away. "Wow, you walk fast." She laughed, trying to diffuse the unknown awkwardness between them, but it seemed as if she was aiming at a wall rather than hitting the target initiated. "Are you feeling okay? You kinda ran out on me. I was worried I had done something to upset you," she explained, her posture straightened as her hand slowly reached out for Deku's shoulder. At first Izuku had no idea what to say, what to do. Was he supposed to turn around and once again see the horrific sight of his friend? No, he could not handle it. Not whilst he could hear her voice. "I'm fine. Tired," he almost coughed out. He was never rude before, even towards Kaken, who practically treated him like crap since finding out that Deku was quirkless. Ochako's eyes were staring at Deku intensely though, and she did not believe a word he said. "Deku, you don't sound fine. Please, we're your friends. You can open up to us if you need to dash." When her hand finally touched his shoulder gently, Izuku suddenly flinched away. The next moment of silence conveyed a lot of emotions which Ochako was finding hard to process. She felt confused as to why Deku would treat her so distantly, she felt shocked to see him act so differently. But most importantly, she was scared. She felt her heart sinking as her ears caught the words of the male very well. "Leave me alone." His voice was cold, unpleasant, but alarming. "I don't need your pity or so-called sympathy." He took off again. This time his steps were confident but slow, leaving Uraraka by herself in the corridor. In reality, the other classmates were standing behind a wall, listening to the conversation and shocked by Izuku's sudden persona change. Mina stood behind the Baku squad, biting her lip as she thought how heartbroken Ochako must have felt. She felt lost. Her hands rubbed together as her vision zoned out, her mind running at full speed and yet, like a hamster, stuck in one place. She took a deep breath as her thoughts all came to one conclusion. She knew she was stubborn, and yet, Izuku needed help. He was silently screaming. And that was his cry for help. The brunette had no idea how to explain it, but she just knew. Days passed, and Izuku never felt more lost in his life. And irritated with the current situation. Trying to get back to the reality that once believed was gone, only to still feel the horrors of his life flash before his eyes every time he heard a familiar sound felt like torture. Not to mention the weight of the situation on his shoulders. So many times he avoided simple human contact and conversations with others simply because he knew the consequences it would carry. One small detail about his mental state slipping through, and it would be game over. To him, to his dear friends, to everything he had to repair. And no matter how many times Uraraka tried to talk to Izuku only to be pushed away again, she wouldn't give up. Even the others noticed how Deku began treating his dear friends with neglect and ignorance. Todoroki would try to start a conversation, no matter how small or insignificant it appeared. But it would only turn into an awkward silence after a few minutes, with the dark-haired male standing up and leaving, muttering something along the lines of, "important thing at hand." Even Bakugo began getting frustrated with Deku's behavior, to a point once he came up to his desk and almost blew up his book. "But, I said something, answer me." His raspy voice reached Izuku's ears. Unfortunately, Izuku's eyes remained fixated on his notebook on the desk, not even flinching when his hero name was called out. Bakugo felt his anger rising, but also the unease when he looked at his childhood friend to punch bag. This wasn't the Izuku he knew, this wasn't the male who promised to become the #1 hero. Deku, however, simply stood up, not wanting to take the sight of Bakugo's liveless eyes and his bleeding arms, bones sticking out rather than actual hands. Bakugo grunted as he reached out his hand, almost near Deku's head as his quirk once again created little explosions. "I didn't say you can effing leave." His voice rose again, but this time even Ground Zero felt another hand on his shoulder, pulling him away and asking him to tone down. It was Kirishima, and though the red-haired male didn't like it much when his boyfriend yelled, he couldn't help but to feel uneasy about Deku too. "Hey, let's talk dash." But before Kirishima could say anything more, the ground beneath them shook, causing the other students to gasp and start looking around frantically. Deku's hands caught his head, dropping to his knees as a result of the ground shaking. He felt a tremendous ache, his vision going blurry for a moment before the voices around him all sounded so distant to him. His eyes looked up, and for a second, for a little moment, he could see Todoroki's head properly positioned. Only to close his eyes from his head pain and look at his friend again. His face was once again bruised up, with half of his skull ripped from the rest of the head as his fresh brain throbbed and bled down his hair and neck. "What's going on?" one of the students shouted, most likely Mineta taking in the annoying pitch of the voice. Todoroki ran up to the window, but still kept his distance as he looked down, taking in the commotion. His eyes widened as his fists tightened. "It's the League of Villains." He turned to others alarmingly, his body ready to run and fight the villains, only to stop halfway at the sound of the window shattering. Shoto's eyes stared down, his arms quickly dropped as his face dropped. The next moment Izuku recollected was how the body of Shoto collapsed on the floor, face down. Deku could hear Mina and Haru's muffled screams through his headache as he saw Shoto's blood slowly trickle down his neck to the floor. Izuku's green eyes looked at the half and half, his eyes widening upon seeing the appearance of the male change before his eyes. Now, he could see the male laying dead on the floor with a knife plunged right at the back of his head, stabbing through his skull and the brain, causing the blood to trickle down his body onto the floor. As the others panicked, either ran out to help others get to safety, or went to fight the League, avenging their friend. All but Deku, who slowly crawled on his knees towards the friend who he failed to save. The second time he did not save him, even though that was his whole point of coming back. He felt guilt crawl up his spine, as well as shock rise in him. The League of Villains attacked after the class came back from forest training. Why did they attack so soon? Izuku grabbed the left hand of the dead male, gripping it tightly as it turned cold, now his whole body matching its temperature. Tears poured down the green-eyed male's cheeks as he curled up closer to Shoto. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." He repeated the same phrase, as if chanting it would bring his dear companion back to life. But all he could hear were the screams of others, the bangs and the thuds which surrounded him after he was left alone in the classroom with the cold and motionless body of Shoto. Deku's head quickly turned to the window as once again he heard a scream which sounded too familiar to go unnoticed. He froze again, realizing that if he needed to reverse time right now. His hands reached to the pocket of his trousers, shaking my gripping the phone as he turned it over, his voice trembling as he desperately tried to remember Tom's instructions. He took deep breaths as his eyes located the red button and pressed it so hard his fingers turned white. "Come on, come on, come on," he chanted, closing his eyes as he rocked himself, his phone pressed tightly to his chest as he curled up. Tears streaming down his cheeks, soon he lost the feeling in both of his hands, his eyelids feeling heavy. He opened his eyes to check if his phone was still in his hand. But upon looking around he noticed how all of the surroundings changed, and what was the classroom he was in previously with the dead body of Shoto, was now the school grounds once again. The sun rays delicately reflecting on his skin as the phone was once again in his back pocket. Izuku's hand extended towards the device once more, his anticipation growing as he pressed the power button to illuminate the screen. Just as the display came to life, a sudden notification appeared, catching his attention as his phone vibrated softly in his hand. "Time reset activated. Remember your place, and good luck." The dark-haired male watched as the screen turned off, noticing his reflection once again. He was still not used to the darker hair, despite looking at the reflection on his phone. He quickly averted the gaze, not wanting to waste any more contacts with Tom. He only had 4 more. But he was determined to save everyone. And he was sure it was going to be this one. Izuku headed towards the door of the UA Academy, trying to not think too much of the message about time travel. For some reason it appeared more foreign to him than the first time Tom introduced his quirk, and Deku wanted to avoid as many complications as possible. When he reached the classroom, he expected his classmates to chat amongst themselves before Mr. Aizawa would come in. However, as soon as his hand touched the door and slid it open, to his surprise he was met with an empty homeroom classroom, not a single distorted person inside. The clock was the only thing that could fill the ears of the male. Izuku looked at the floor as he turned around, confused to the core as to where everyone was, only to soon hear someone call out his name from the corridor. His eyes perked up, only feel his soul leave his body at the sight of Shoji. Or at least what was left of him in Izuku's eyes. His mask was blood-stained, only dangling around his neck since the only part Izuku could focus on was half of the jaw ripped out, displaying the enormous tongue that unraveled all the way down to his chest. Mezu was missing a portion of his teeth, other than the ones which were engraved deep in the tissue of the cheeks, the scarlet blood still dripping from his skull. Midoriya? Did you hear me? His voice sounded ragged, as if it was running on its last bits of energy. Izuku shook his head, looking at the male in confusion, trying his best to voice the sight of Shoji's mouth. He pulled a fake, apologetic smile on his face, his hand scratching the side of his head where the ends of his hair tickled and itched his face. I'm sorry, could you repeat? Shoji's brows furrowed, the last 2 remaining arms crossed over his chest as the wings of his 4 missing tentacles dangled in the air, allowing his drops of blood to stain the floor. I said the class is outside training today. Izuku felt lost, questions orbiting his head as he seemed to get no answers, no matter where he looked or what he had asked. He was still confused as to why the day suddenly altered upon time traveling, even if Tom assured him that Deku would always end up in the same place he was first teleported to. The dark-haired male was beginning to wonder if his American friend even knew what his quirk was capable of. As they walked outside, Izuku's eyes focused on his school uniform, or at least what it was, because when he glanced down his eyes widened upon seeing his sport outwear. Wasn't he wearing the tie just a minute ago? Upon arriving in the outside training area, Deku could still feel his brain stir with questions and concerns. The uncomfortable feeling in his gut never disappeared. He was dreading to look up at his friends who were teamed up outside for a task to complete. His green eyes briefly glanced at the white and red-haired male, whose appearance now changed. Now, he still kept his face, however Izuku could not ignore the massive knife that was plunged right between his skull and his spine. He felt his head hurt once again, the migraine coming stronger than previously. Bakuga's eyes glared at Deku, noticing him finally joining the rest of the class for the lesson. He scoffed under his breath, rolling his eyes as if to even fool himself that he hasn't found Deku's behavior strange lately. His head turned to Kirishima, who once again gave him the smile which Katsuki first fell for. The red-haired male's hand gently grabbed Dynamite's shoulder. He squeezed it, tilting his head a little to look the male in the eyes. Yeah, I'm worried about him too. His smile never faded, even when Bakuga looked at him with a frown and his usual angry demeanor. Shut up, shitty hair. I'm not worried about that loser. His raspy voice rose up, a few explosions followed from his hand as his boyfriend nodded, a smile still in his face. Reading off Bakuga was something sort of a second nature to enjoy, no matter how hard he tried to protest. I do agree with Bakuga though, Ochako spoke up, a little awkward to barge in their conversation as she came up to them. I didn't say a demon thing. Bakuga's fists clenched once again, his red eyes now staring right at the gravity girl who seemed to be nonchalant to the blonde-haired screaming. It's natural once you become close friends with the Baku squad, as Mina and Kaminari called it. Kirishima's focus soon shifted to Ochako too, his eyes peeking with curiosity. Deku has been acting different. I tried to talk to him a few times, but all he would do is shut me out. I do hope he's okay. The brunette's eyebrows furrowed, a small frown appearing on her face as her eyes followed Izuku's every step. Kirishima nodded, stepping a little closer to Uravity, his focus never leaving her. To be honest, I thought that if anyone were to get anything out of him, it would be or Katsuki, Kirishima confessed, shrugging as the two males exchanged looks. The two were always sure that the brunette had some feelings towards Deku. To be honest, the whole class suspected. It seemed pretty obvious at first, however now, it was clear to Kirishima and Bakugo that something probably changed in her. Perhaps it was the current situation, or maybe a confession between the two heroes in training. Soon Todoroki approached the three as well, joining in the conversation. Bakugo felt his face reddening, not enjoying the company of Icy Hot as he called him. Though his usual quiet demeanor, he too was worried about their once-known sunshine friend. "Do you think he's sick?" asked Shuto. His mismatched eyes slowly darted towards Kirishima and Baku. The blonde male gritted his teeth, staring at Todoroki with disfavor. "And why do you think I care?" Bakugo snarled back, a smile forming on his face as he changed into a fighting stance, confident and certain. "I'm stronger than Deku anyways, even if he's sick and tired." He smiled confidently. Kirishima and Ochako just glanced at him thoughtfully. Even if Deku was tired, usually he would tell us that he hadn't been sleeping well, right? Kirishima crossed his arms. Ochako shrugged. "Perhaps. Anyways, what did Aizawa-sensei say what we're doing today?" The others looked at Ida, who seemed to be the only one paying attention to the announcement, giving up their hopes on asking their teacher again. Tenya looked sternly at the rest of the class, all of their eyes staring at him with both intensity and uncertainty. His back straightened even more, his hands chopping down as he explained every single step of the tasks they were assigned to do, as the others slowly began understanding why they stopped listening to Aizawa in the first place. Ochako felt her eyes getting heavier. Listening to Ida explain the task made her sleepy. That was until she caught movement in the corner of her eyes, noticing the dark-haired male she was worried about suddenly appearing near her, a few leaves stuck in his hair. Her eyebrows furrowed as she noticed the male shoving the phone in his back pocket. She was sure that Aizawa specifically asked them to not take out their mobiles during field practice. Especially today. Hence why we now have to go to one of the three locations provided. We must calculate the urgency and the probability of civilians getting hurt in the potential areas, and must therefore decide which one is the most important to be saved first. We need to go to the furthest one away. The whole class froze as they suddenly heard the dark-haired male raise his voice for the first time in so many days. All of the eyes slowly turned to him and started focusing on Izuku, a determined look on his face. However, Otako, upon a deeper look, could sense a slight undertone of concern and perhaps fear. Tanya fixed his glasses as he turned his whole entire body towards Deku, his eyes masked behind his glasses. "Izuku, we need to calculate the probability. He started explaining again only to be interrupted by the boy, who grabbed his forearm and stared at him with a dangerous glint. "Tenya, trust me." The taller male was thrown back by the sudden behavior that erupted from Izuku. He stepped back, almost losing his composure. Kirishima then suddenly stepped into the conversation, their eyes staring at the blue-head male with understanding. "I think Izuku may be onto something here, let's just trust him." The red-head male smiled awkwardly at the stern class representative, wanting to defuse this situation. "If you think of it this way, maybe the one furthest away will need our immediate help?" To that, even Bakugo sided with Kirishima, slowly stepping next to him and staring at Ida with his usual frown. "Hey, can't we just split up?" Siro scratched the back of his head, his eyes switching between his friends as the rest of the class found the commotion rather unusual, considering how the danger levels of the three locations were exactly the same. Unfortunately, no one seemed to listen, other than Denki, who stood next to him, but did not even exchange a look with him. If all of us take care of the task, we will be done quicker." The electrically quirked male shrugged as he followed the group in the front. A loud sigh could be heard from the other individuals, not particularly excited once again by the victims of miscommunications centering around Midoriya. Eventually everyone headed towards the point where their task awaited them. The brunette female constantly seemed to have her eyes on Izuku, noticing how paranoid he appeared, his eyes constantly looking around the forest and grounds, walking further into it. Uravity took another deep breath, her steps only getting faster to come closer to the dark-haired male. Her hand gently poked his shoulder, catching his attention. His green eyes looked at her in confusion and yet temporary shock. "Hey, so, why that point?" she asked, her head tilting a little. "Sorry, I'm still a little confused," giggled a little. Unfortunately, her awkwardness was not covered. "Is it gonna start at her for a little while, before he turned away again and keeps on walking?" "It doesn't matter," he blurted. Ochako stood dumbfounded, blinking twice before even realizing they had reached the supposed danger area. The whole class looked up, noticing a wooden tower which was no more than 3 levels high, windows on all 4 sides at every level. The task was simple, as Ida explained. The building was supposed to be on fire, so the heroes in training had to get inside and get the people, or in fact dummies, out as safely as possible before the supposed explosion. And the class completed the task relatively quickly too. It only took approximately 5 minutes for others to think of a plan before they all decided to tackle different levels of the wooden tower. Half of the class was in charge of getting the dummies out, whilst the other half was in charge of trying to put the supposed fire out. And this time even Bakugo seemed to be following the instructions that others gave him. And everything was going smoothly, until suddenly Shoji reached the highest point of the tower. Right at the top, there was a small doll in the shape of a baby. He gently grabbed the doll, however he suddenly froze upon hearing a loud explosion with his extra air that came out of his tentacle. Another one of his arms turned into an eye and looked around out of the window to see what had happened. At first he expected Bakugo, however to his horror, he noticed a building in the far distance on fire as the fire continued, some things in the far distance attacking in through the outside. He leaned out of the window to look down at the rest of the classmates as they stared up at him in confusion. Someone attacked the academy. Anyways, what did Aizawa-sensei say about what we're doing today? Izuku looked around at everyone, noticing how every person's eyes were looking wide at Ida, looking for help. It wasn't unusual for others to forget or misunderstand the assignment, however the dark-haired male reckoned that it was his cue. With the focus shifted from him, he quietly hid in the bushes and the trees, crouching down as his hand took out the phone from his pocket. Without unlocking the screen, he stared at the reflection, his eyes desperately looking for any changes in the screen. And to his relief, soon he was met with the eyes of the black-haired boy Tom, who did seem to notice the environment change around Deku. "Izuku, are you alright? Why are you outside?" Tom, although looking relieved to see the dark-haired male alive and well, was worried to see the subtle changes in the world around Izuku. He knew that even if that could be a good sign, many factors were dependent on the mental state of the individual traveling through time. "Tom, something is happening, I don't know why, but when I reverse time, I didn't go back to the same day that I arrived initially. We haven't had field practice since I arrived." Izuku, although trying to stay as quiet as possible, felt his nerves begin to take control over him, his hands gripping the small device in his hands. He had to take a deep breath to make sure that his only source of control was not damaged. The dark-haired male's face slowly turned into worry with each passing second, realization setting in. Izuku felt frustrated, his teeth gritting. "I thought you said I will always come back to the first day." His voice came out more mercenary than he initiated. The dark-haired hero felt his head spin as the world around him got surprisingly brighter. He took a few more breaths, trying his best to listen to the voice of the boy from the future. "That's what I thought too. I think it's different for every person dash." Tom fiddled with his hands, pinching and rolling the skin at the back of his palms. "Different? You said you were certain?" Tom almost jumped at the sound of Izuku's voice. His posture slumped, his shoulders raising as he shrunk in his place, ashamed of his actions. Izuku noticed the change and mentally cursed, once again getting angry at himself for losing control. I'm sorry, Tom. It's all just," he sighed again, desperately clinging onto the little control he had left. "What happened to people you helped previously? How did your quirk work on their time traveling?" This time, his words came out clear. His breathing slowed down as he looked at the screen. Tom nodded, however did not meet the eye of the male. "Other people always come up to me with lesser issues. You know, like failed tests or date disasters. Their goals were more precise. They already knew what they wanted and how they would accomplish their mission. The dark-haired male explained, his eyes slowly meeting the green ones of Izuku. Izuku, I think what's happening is, I think the timeline is somehow trying to help you. You do not know what happened exactly and how your friends died, and so your brain is trying to play out every single possibility which could potentially be either a success or another downfall. Deku felt his heart sinking in his chest. Once again, it's to do with your mental state, Izuku. The hero's head dropped, staring at the grass underneath him, his finger tapping against the red reset button. So, this means I won't be able to replay the exact date everything went wrong? Deku asked, his voice slightly trembling. Tom shook his head, but an understanding look was still on his face. When you resented the timeline on your device, phone or whatever, did you get a notification? Something like, I don't know how to explain it, welcome message. The American boy looked around the corners, his hands fumbling as he tried his best to take Izuku once more through his quirk. Izuku thought back to when he arrived in the morning, remembering the message that popped up. Something did, about checking the date. Deku nodded, his eyes averting to the red button again. Tom snapped his fingers. There we go. You need to check every time. And though it may seem pointless, especially since the timeline seems to be changing from what I can infer, it's better to make sure you know how you're standing with your friends. Because it may be that you will be carrying the moments of the previous timelines along with you to the next try. The dark-haired male suddenly heard Ida's voice begin to raise, realizing he did not have much time. He shifted, slowly standing up. All right, thanks Tom. He looked away from the phone. Tom took a sharp breath before his voice quickly pitched. Remember you have 3 contacts left dash. And like that his voice was cut off as Izuku shoved the phone in his pocket, walking up to the rest of the class. His head was hung low, not wanting to draw any attention, however he could sense someone's eyes following his movements. His eyes momentarily looked up. If some of the moments from the previous timelines could carry on forward, it was highly possible that the League of Villains was about to attack the UA Academy. Most of the students were out of the school for training. This meant that Izuku had to make sure that the class would be away from the danger as much as possible. The students stared in shock as they took in the news, everybody's eyes staring at the smoke which was erupting into the air like from a volcano. Bakugo, however, turned his full attention to Deku, who stood a little slumped, but confident. The blonde male knew the now dark-haired male well enough to notice the somewhat assured spark in his green eyes. The red-eyed male stomped towards Izuku, his hands grabbing the other male by the collar as his expression turned into pure rage. Did you know about this? The blonde yelled at the other male, his grip tightening as small explosions threatened to set alight. Bakugo shook the dark-haired male, both of his hands on the collar of his school uniform. Kirishima and Todoroki interfered, trying to pull the two away from each other before a fight broke out. Andrew grabbed the blonde male by his shoulders, gently, pulling him away, looking at him in the eye to calm him down. Easy there. Kirishima's grin got tighter as Bakugo began struggling. Todoroki had to stand in front of Izuku, shielding the male with his body. Come on, buddy, Deku would never do that. Bakugo, get a hold of yourself. Soon Siro and Denki ran up to the two as well, facing the blonde and trying to calm him down. Todoroki's fire slowly began covering his arm, engulfing his hair as his eyes started glowing blue. Izuku felt his heart clench at the sight of others fighting. However, his eyes only dropped to the ground, not wanting to look Bakugo in the eyes. Because even if the others did not believe so, Katsuki wasn't exactly wrong. Izuku could hear the voices of the others trying to calm down the blonde, their voices distorted like their bodies through the eyes of Izuku Midoriya. Deku glanced at the screen, not sure what to do now to ensure others would stay safe for the time being. He just needed to make sure they will survive this day, and everything will be alright. As their voices rose up, Izuku felt a gentle touch on his shoulder. His green eyes rose up to look at the face with half of the tissue burned off, the dried-up blood flowing down from the dripping eyeball. The brunette girl that he once thought could fight any enemy that she came across. But even through the malformation, he saw the look of concern, a frown on her bloody lips as her full attention was on the dark-haired male. And for a split moment, it was just them in their own comfort, solitude and reticence. Deku, what's wrong? Her voice was gentle. Though Izuku knew what answer she was really looking for, he knew it would only make matters worse if he didn't tell her. He looked away from her. A lump at the back of his throat formed as his stomach twisted. I can't tell you. I'm sorry. His voice shattered, barely audible to Uravati, who still looked at him with an understanding but stern expression. Does it have to do with the attack? She asked once more, his breathing hitched suddenly. His green eyes still on the ground, internally screaming at himself to just tell her, pleading and fighting himself. Not in the way you think. His voice was barely above a whisper, his fists tightening as the twist in his stomach was somehow a little more bearable than it was before. Ochako's brown eyes stared at Izuku, her gaze softening a little, and yet she felt more confused than before. She blinked once, her head shaking a little as she looked away confused. But before she could ask him any further, she heard the voice of some classmates announce out loud. We need to go back. No. Everyone's eyes turned towards the black-haired male, his posture standing firm as his green eyes looked at others in desperation. The class was shocked to see Deku's reaction to coming back to UA, and yet the sense of uneasiness only arose further. The F, do you mean no? Bakugo snarled, about to come closer to Izuku, only to be stopped by Kirishima holding his bicep. First you chose the location furthest away from that diamond building and now you won't even fight the FING villains that attacked it? Most of the class, though not appreciating Bakugo's current attitude, were confused as to why Deku would act like this. Tsuyu fiddled with her hands as she looked at Izuku, trying to think of a reason as to why he did not want to fight. Izuku stood firm on the ground, though his insides were trembling with worry and confusion. Come on man, we're heroes, we don't run away from a fight. Denki looked towards the dark-haired male, stretching, ready to fight the oncoming danger. Besides, it's our academy. What if there are still people inside? Mina added, taking a step closer to Bakugo, her fists tightening, taking on her fighting stance. Others came up to Bakugo, some of them already beginning to head back. Deku panicked, his breathing picked up as he ran up to Tsuyu, adrenaline blocking any images of the distorted friend in his eyes. No, wait. The other students were out of the building when we were leaving. Besides, other teachers are in there, they can handle themselves. Tsuyu's face presented pure confusion and shock, unable to digest Izuku's current behavior. Everyone else was confused too. Ochako stood frozen as she stared at the dark-haired male, never thinking she would ever see Deku back down. Tsuyu finally pulled away from the male, snapping her arm away. Mina groaned, frustrated. We don't have time for this. She turned on her heel and started stomping towards the academy, her eyes fixated on the building which was still somehow standing. Others began following her shortly after. The villains are there, we need to wait this out. Izuku ran towards Todoroki this time, grabbing him by the elbow, the red and white veins apparent on the male's forearms as his quirk began slowly activating. Todoroki turned around to face the dark-haired male, who looked away from his neck to avoid glancing at the knife that was plunged deep into the red and white-haired's throat, the point slightly sticking out through the front of the neck. Wait it out? Midoriya, do you hear yourself? Shoto's voice was low, but his demeanor somehow grew dangerous. The school is under an attack. The others could be in danger and you're saying we should wait it out? Deku, what's going on with you, man? Kirishima's eyes soon looked at Izuku with frustration as well, not understanding the logic of the changed classmate. Look, we get it if you're going through something, but we are heroes and we need to act. We must stay here. Deku raised his voice, feeling how his blood pulsed through his whole body, his muscles beginning to ache. The tension in his body felt familiar, and yet all he had his mind set on was to keep everyone away from danger. I'm going by. Mina finally shouted, her hands forming acid, ready to fight anyone who came her way. Izuku's eyes flashed as he looked towards her, a high-pitched noise in his ears appearing, his heart hammering in his ears once he looked towards the pink-skinned girl. The dark-haired male reached out to her, his hands snapping her way in attempt to hold her down. Unfortunately, before Izuku could do anything else, the ringing and the pounding got too unbearable. Darkness engulfed him, his eyes shutting upon not being able to get the grasp of reality. His body disobeyed him. It was cold. The wind blew in his face, His longer hair tickled his closed eyelids as well as the bridge of his nose. His eyelids were somehow too heavy for him to open. His eyes, only causing his heart rate to slow down. The pitching in his ears returned, the voices and footsteps distant, and yet with every second he could hear them better. He almost choked at the smell of rotten meat near his nose, and yet for some reason he needed to stay down. He had no idea why, but the gut feeling was almost nauseous. He tried to move, and almost winced, only then realizing his body was in pain. The pulsing ache in his left arm was slowly spreading to his shoulder, not to mention the agonizing sensation in his legs which he could only describe as tremendous at the least. Izuku felt his throat clench around itself at the flash in front of his eyes, remembering the battlefield before time traveling. His eyes slowly opened, and immediately the dark-haired male had to hold his breath. Beside him laid the motionless body of Mina. Or at least what remained of it. Her whole arm was disintegrated, leaving an open wound where her shoulder was meant to be. Blood covered the open tissue on her back which stuck to the remains of her school uniform, its shreds caught in fire that surrounded Deku and the dead classmate. His own arm was gray and bruised up, bent backwards in an uncomfortable manner, and yet he didn't think about the pain anymore. He only stared at his friend whose face was lying in the mud. Tears formed in his eyes, sobbing as he once again relived the moment he wanted to prevent. He tried to turn his head, desperately wanting to see the horror which he somehow knew awaited him. But he soon felt a grasp around his face, cold fingers digging into his cheeks that caused him to wince. "And yet, you're still breathing," said a feminine voice. Izuku knew that tone all too well. His eyes looked up as he struggled, noticing the blonde messy buns and that blood-thirsty smile on Toga Himiko's face. She was crouching right in front of him, her whole attire in red-blooded stains, her dirty needle sliding across his cheek playfully as she giggled. "And here I thought we finished all the dirty work," her voice cheered again. Deku felt fury rise in his veins, his eyes glaring right into the golden eyes of the villainess. With all the power he still held, he quickly placed it right next to her face and snapped his finger. A blast formed, hitting Toga right in the head, shunting her and causing her body to fly back with a loud scream of pain erupting from her throat. Deku heard someone call out behind him, but he didn't recognize the voice. Or he had, but he didn't care at that point. His face almost dropped to the ground, as he quickly turned to his side and with the remaining strength he still held, he grabbed his phone from the back pocket. He had slight difficulty with the broken finger that dangled as he reached down, but Izuku could not focus on the pain. He could not focus on anything else apart from the failure he once again committed. He failed everyone again. He quickly grasped the phone in his hand, hearing footsteps approach him. He pressed the button tightly with his finger, soon his eyes catching a glimpse of what appeared to be a bright blue flame. He closed his eyes and waited. For the pain or anything at this point. His breathing hitched and his eyes shut tighter. "Deku? Deku!" The dark-haired male suddenly jumped in his seat, his hands grasping to anything that was closest to him. He gripped the edge of the desk in front of him, his eyes wide and scanning the room full of eyes, staring at him as if he had just grown another head. Though in this world anything was possible. His eyes stopped midway to glance at Mina, whose deformality changed in his eyes. At least she now had both legs attached to her body, only her arm missing. Deku looked down, trying to not appear more crazy than he already had been, and not too cheerful, no matter how relieved he was that he managed to go back in time. And yet a dreadful shiver crawled up his body, the thought of seeing everyone dead, and the chance of having to relive this moment caused his guilt to arise in him. Uraraka's hand flinched away from Izuku as soon as he was shaken awake from his abnormal blackout. 1 minute Mr. Aizawa walked out of the room, and the next everyone gasped as they heard Deku's head hit the desk. But the most mortifying part was how quickly he woke up from his blackout. "Deku, maybe it's better if you go to the nurse? You don't look well." Koji never spoke much to Deku, but even he leaned over to see Izuku's face better. Izuku without a further thought stood up and gathered his things, before he left the room in a hurry, leaving everyone dumbfounded. He needed to check the date. "Uraraka? I asked you something?" Ochako's head snapped up as she heard her name being mentioned, snapping her from her headspace. She looked up at Mina and Tiu who sat opposite her, their eyes staring at the brunette with sympathy and commotion. Mina rolled her eyes playfully. First Deku, now you? Are we sure this isn't something contagious? Her eyebrows wiggled, teasing poor Uraraka, who currently stared at her with an annoyed expression. The brunette rolled her eyes, leaning a bit forward on the table. Sorry Tsuyu, I zoned out. And no, her brown eyes stared directly at Mina, who was still smirking. I haven't been spending time with him. Especially since she looked down, her brows furrowed as her hand motioned around, unable to find the proper words. Mina's head tilted to the side. Gone emo? Her question once again caused both Tsuyu and Ochako's eyes to roll. Her head turned away, she caught the sight of the other classmates coming in. Mina and Tsuyu noticed their friends, waving at them and smiling to greet them, even if they were going the other way. Ochako's eyes, however, stared at the blonde explosive male and his boyfriend, who chatted whilst walking with their hands intertwined. Kirishima was the first to notice Ochako staring at them. He gave her a warm smile and waved at her with his free hand. Bakugo eventually looked her way and nodded, his red eyes seeming to stare at her for a second too long. Uraraka felt her cheeks burn up a little, smiling at them and waving back, desperately trying to hide her admiration towards the two males. When their eyes drifted away from her, she felt relief and slight dissatisfaction, wishing that she could spend more time with the two males. She admired Katsuki and Injiro. Both of them motivated her to go forward and become stronger in their own ways. Katsuki, although he wasn't one to compliment someone in any situation, was one of the first people to treat her like an actual opponent. She felt weirdly appreciated by that, and she was also glad that someone treated her quirk like an actual power rather than just a side ability anyone could perform. Whereas Injiro was someone that always kept her optimistic, telling her comments about how strong and confident she was, about how awesome she was during training. Not to mention how he would often act as a translator and compliment Uraraka on his and Bakugo's behalf. Soon she managed to ignore the insults Bakugo would throw at everybody and noticed the gestures he presented. Besides, it was funny to tease him about actually caring about others. Always got him riddled up. She was grateful for having two friends like them. But she probably realized that they had this type of charm to make anyone feel special about themselves. Perhaps that was the reason her eyes now seemed to be looking out for them when she entered the classroom, or her eyes would linger on them when training, listening to their voices when she had the chance. Though she felt slightly embarrassed, never wanting to admit that. Her head turned back to Tsuyu. What was your question again? She asked, scratching her left cheek a little harder than before. Katsuki squeezed Kirishima's hand tighter, walking past the doors towards the field. The smell of the food was enough to make his stomach rumble, and yet he would rather starve than eat with the extras. Or at least that is what he told himself. Kirishima knew it too. They both sat down under the tree, desperately looking for shade in this heat. Kirishima sighed in content, raising his face higher and not having the sun rays blaze right in his eyes. Summer was approaching, and honestly the horrendous heat was even faster. It felt like pure torture, especially to those who still had training lessons in the afternoon. Even Katsuki was happy that they won't have to do much for the rest of the day. Hey Katsuki? Kirishima's smile spread on his face, his red eyes gazing towards the blonde who did not even turn his head, but he was listening. You seemed deep in thought before. Wanna talk about it, man? He asked, their hands still intertwined. Bakugo just scoffed and ripped some still green grass from underneath him, ripping it in his hands and setting it up with his quirk. And why should I care about that loser? He's just an extra with a good-for-nothing quirk. He snarled in his usual demeanor, his eyes averted at the ground as he spoke. Upon hearing Katsuki's words, Kirishima's eyebrows furrowed, looking at the sky. Wait, you're right, I haven't seen Deku use his quirk since… What, you know? The red-haired male scratched the back of his head. His eyes glanced at his boyfriend, staring at the expression which with time became easier to understand to Kirishima. He was good at reading Bakugo, even if the blonde did not admit it. Which was ironic considering that since they started going out together, Bakugo would follow Kirishima like a lost puppy. Do you think something happened to his quirk? Asked the red-haired male, his frame leaning forward a tad bit to look Bakugo in the eye. Katsuki stared at the ground, However, unlike usual, he didn't smile wickedly. He didn't have this glance up with his fiery explosions summoned from his hand. He didn't wish the dark green-haired male the worst. This time, he simply shook his head, but his expression remained the same. No, Deku may be a loser, but I doubt he lost his goddamn quirk. And I doubt anything bad happened to it, otherwise the whole class would know. Or at least the teachers, and as far as I could see, even those privileged idiots had no idea what's going on, Bakugo explained, ripping out another strand of grass from the ground, crumbling it in his hand before he threw it away. Kirishima shrugged, leaning back against the tree. Maybe he hadn't told them yet. Or maybe he believes he has to go through it alone. The male questioned, and all Katsuki did was raise his head and look towards the windows of the academy. He watched as other students roamed the halls, unaware of the weather outside. Then it's his DMN business. Leave him alone and let him figure it out himself. If someone started bothering me about my problems, I would blow their DMN faces off. Katsuki's tone came out as threatening. And yet, what the blonde male was talking about usually would not come out of his mouth if it wasn't just the two of them alone. Kirishima smiled as he looked at his partner. And he was grateful for this moment, when if he observed just a little deeper, he could see how the red eyes of Katsuki softened. His arrogant and complacent facade lowered just enough to allow Kirishima in and comfort Bakugo. And once again, Bakugo was right. Sometimes, one can only be helped when asking for a helping hand. And Round Face better understand it soon. Suddenly Bakugo's voice snarled. His grip around Kirishima's hand tightened, his teeth gritting. That idiot constantly barges into other people's faces and expects everyone to open up to her like a FING dictionary. The red-haired male's smile dropped at the mention of Uraraka. His eyes looked down just like Bakugo's. The truth was, both of them admired her strength. They always thought of her as a strong and independent person who would often put more in her mouth than she could chew. Her smile was often a motivation for the red-haired male. Her words of encouragement only fueled him to strive forward. And Bakugo? He loved to tease her, calling her different names, seeing her frustration. It made him laugh with how quickly he could rile her up. Which is probably why he would be incredibly flustered whenever she would mirror his teasing or would, as always, use her smile to charm him, unknowingly. Unfortunately, that was also the reason why both Kirishima and Bakugo were worried about her. They knew she often would do anything to ensure her friends were content and safe. That she would sometimes go to far lengths just to please someone. And often she didn't exactly accept a negative answer from others, which caused her to appear a little pushy. Kirishima knew she meant no harm, but the last thing he would ever dream about would be for her to get hurt. And both of the males knew that Bakugo felt the same, even if he never admitted it. Yeah, I know. I don't want her to get hurt either, Katsuki. Both of their eyes averted towards the window of the canteen. They stared at the brunette who was chatting with Hertziu and Mina, her hand rubbing her left eye as she talked. Both of them sighed, only hoping for things to somehow work out with time. Deku paced around the corridors, not even sure what he was really after. He had checked the date multiple times, and somehow all the numbers seemed to blur in front of his eyes, mixing into one which only caused him more confusion. The worst part? He had no idea what was going on with the timeline. At one moment, everyone seemed to look at him in pity, and as soon as he blinked, every single classmate turned to him in fury, only once again looking at him with some sort of compassion in their eyes as if they knew what he was going through. Pretty ironic. This was his third try, but for some reason things did not appear to get any better. Even if everyone was alive as of now, a crawling feeling kept on constantly cooling at the back of his neck, reminding him of the presence which he was unable to identify. He tried for a moment to think back to what happened right before he arrived here. The dead body of the pink-skinned friend, dead by his side. He knew he almost caught her hand, so then why did he collapse? Why did he wake up a minute later only to discover that he was once again the only sole survivor on the battlefield? Why was everything getting worse as soon as he finally would think that he had some sort of control over the situation? It's as if some greater force did not want him to succeed at all. But he had to do it. He was finally given the opportunity to fight back to save all the lives of his friends that he lost. This was his only chance and he was not going to blow it away. Suddenly, Izuku grabbed the sides of his head, his eyes shutting tight as he felt that inevitable pain in his brain, the high-pitched noise returning. His hands gripped his own dark hair tightly, almost collapsing to his knees as the pain almost shut him out of reality again. Hundreds of questions swirled up in his mind as he tried to calm down his headache, and at the same time trying to find an answer. Was it the League of Villains? But then, how did they manage to cause such havoc in such a short span of time? How long has it been since he had collapsed? Many things did not add up, but then on the other hand, who did not want to contact Tom again in case of an emergency? When the headache died down, the dark-haired male leaned against the wall as he looked down. He crossed his arms, still slouching. His eyes were glued to the ground as he thought of the next actions that should be taken. He had to somehow find a pattern or correlation, some way to be able to predict when the danger would occur, so he could at least save his classmates. Or perhaps it would be better somehow to figure out the reason behind every single downfall. Deku! The male almost jumped at the sound of the cheerful friend coming up to him and calling out his name. His green eyes turned towards the brunette that slowly came up to him. And though Ochako was always one of the brightest students in Class 1A, even though she appeared to be quite frustrated, Izuku muttered something under his breath, before he turned around on his heel and started heading the opposite direction to her. The brown-eyed girl, however, managed to grab his arm before he did so. Deku, wait. She stopped him as her eyes looked desperately at his face, which was half covered by his now longer hair. But she still hasn't given up. There was a determined spark in her eye, and though Midoriya usually admired it, this time it only caused him to retract from her. He didn't care about how deformed she still looked through his perspective. Why are you avoiding everyone? Ochako's hand gently gripped Izuku's, her eyes focused on the male as he kept on looking away at her. But this was probably the first time in her life where she saw nothing in them. The spark that always shone in his eyes was gone and replaced by some sort of numbness which she could not understand at all. The dark-haired male did not say a single word, his eyes staring right into the brown eye of Uravity, his vision seeing blood smeared on her face and neck as the tissue of the face was ripped off, the flesh present with her eye dripping down the open wound. After only a while he finally broke the silence, his eyes looking away as he snacked his wrist away from the female. I have my reasons to avoid you. His tone came out harsh and cold, his body even turned away, not allowing her to cross any more of his boundaries. Ochako stood, dumbfounded as her body froze. This was the first time she witnessed his cold words with such a cold undertone. The brunette's hands rubbed together as she took one more step closer, her eyebrows furrowed, not dropping her determination. Reasons to avoid anyone and everyone who is worried sick about you, Deku? Her voice rose a little bit, her assertiveness beginning to show more, not backing down from the fight. Even if the one she was fighting was someone dear to her. Izuku felt his mind begin to irritate him again, with the slow throbbing pain becoming more and more evident. The high-pitched noise came back in his ears, the voice of Uraraka beginning to fade into the background noise he was so desperate to listen to again. His fists tightened as his green eyes stared right at the brunette heroine, turning around and leaning over her, his eyes dangerously stared right at her. High black hair no longer covered his eyes, but only momentarily his green eyes stared right into her brown eyes. The reason being the nagging and sticking your nose into someone else's problems. Izuku's voice for the first time was so loud and low, threatening undertone evident to anyone who knew him and studied with him in the same class. Ochako backed down a couple of steps. This side of Deku she had never experienced the male to snap at her so badly. Her eyes stared right into his, still not fully comprehending his initial reaction. The emotion was firstly unknown to Izuku. He could very well understand that he had hurt Ochako, but he also knew he needed to keep his distance. Eventually, Ochako stood still and bowed, her eyes staring at the ground beneath them as her hands dropped to her side. Her left hand momentarily rubbing her eye and scratched the skin underneath. Fine, her voice was stern, but it still held a sense of concern and worry. She straightened her back, took a deep breath and walked past the dark-haired male. Izuku's eyes did not even turn to look at her once more before she left. Ochako stood in her tracks, only to say her final words. You're right, I tend to be too much. But all I ever wanted to do is to help you with whatever you are facing. That is the role of the heroes," she explained, her shoulders slumping forward a little, clearly hurt by the male's previous comment. "I'm not going to push you any further. I can see that this problem is surpassing even for you. It seems to figure it out on your own. I'm sorry for what I have done." And with those words, the brunette left all by himself in the corridor. As Uravati walked away down the corridor, Izuku watched her every step. He felt his own insight twist with disgust, thinking back to what you just said. It was too late to apologize now. Now he was finally left alone with his thoughts only. As Uraraka walked down the corridor, her hand instinctively touched the wall, her other hand beginning to rub her left eye. She winced suddenly, throbbing pain electrocuted through her skull, and as she tried to open her eyes she only saw a smaller portion of the usual vision. Her left eye felt as if it was still, and yet she could not make out the colors and the shapes which phased into the half of her vision. Her breathing picked up as she felt panic soar through, her feet quickly carrying her towards the nurse's office. Was it perhaps the last fight? Or karma? However, the other classmates were not so lucky, because as the brunette walked down the stairs and stepped outside into the fresh air, wanting to get to the nurse's office quicker, she was met with a sight that shook her to the core. Covered her mouth with her hand, she ran towards the dead bodies of two males she considered very close. Her body was dropped to the ground by the bodies of Katuki and Injairu, whose necks were split into two pieces, their heads only attached to their bodies, but on the brink of breaking. Her shaking hands gently touched their cold cheeks, as her brown eyes stared right at the lifeless eyes of the two males. She let out a shattering sob, the tears in her eyes forming before she could even register the second. Her body leaned down closer to the males, a horrific sight of all the other students of the academy slaughtered on the ground. The knife marks were evident on their skin. Ochako was about to stand up and rush to the nurse, her own legs betraying her. The only unsettling thing, and one that was known pretty much a few seconds later, was the sharp plunge of Ochako's back, causing the girl to let out a fanatic scream. The world spun. Tom could feel every single cell in his body setting on fire, ripping itself away and being placed back in his organs. His eyes burning whenever his eyelids closed, his scalp felt like it was being put in hot lava, before quickly dipping an ice bucket on top. But he was used to it. Time travel, his quirk, sometimes was more evil than anticipated, and more dreadful than understood. Unfortunately, even he did not know exactly how well, often getting complaints by the people who traveled. How their body changed, how the timeline wasn't right, how the people around them seemed to be more cautious of the traveler. And no matter how many times he highlighted that one needed to stay focused, that the whole journey will depend mostly on the individual's state of mind, so they have to be mentally prepared. And yet the users still blamed everything on Tom. The black-haired male scratched his head, the pain was still evident and yet with time it was easier to ignore. Avoiding the problem was something he was not very fond of doing, and yet he knew that with some things, ignorance was really a bliss. But that didn't stop the young male to aim higher and look for solutions to make the pain go away whilst using his quirk. Solution finding was simple enough, he could have simply stopped using it in the first place. But how could he say no to someone who was in need? Tom remembered that one time he overheard someone say that quirks develop with time. Hopefully with time the pain would go away. Permanently. It's been another day since Izuku's journey began. And Tom found it quite hard to try and ignore all the other people asking him about the one known pro-hero. At first he found simple excuses, such as explaining that he was sick. Another time he said they had a doctor's appointment, and it usually worked. On the other note, he still needed to come to Inko and explain calmly to her that her son was back in the past, trying to make sure that all his friends stay alive. But that was a problem for another day. Right now, Tom gripped the desk by which he sat, his eyes zoning out. He felt the pain wash over him again, but not once, but twice in a row. He was dumbfounded, confused, only for realization to come to him like an incoming train and hit him like a splash of cold water on the back. Sitting in front of the mirror, he waited patiently, his foot tapping in the ground. He hated how the only way to contact Izuku would be to wait on his call. It honestly felt scary, and yet Tom needed to know why Izuku reversed time 2 times in a row. This was eating him alive. It was killing him to see Izuku begin to look worse and worse with every single call. The tired eyes became more exhausted, his hair beginning to cover most of his upper face, not even caring about having it out of his eyes. But at last, Tom saw a blue swirl appearing right in the mirror, his reflection beginning to merge with the contact portal opening before the pale face of the dark-haired male appeared on the surface. Tom's posture leaned forward, his arms adjusting as he looked like he was hugging his arms, his eyes eagerly taking a look at Izuku. Midoriya seemed to be leaning back against a cold white wall in a dark and cramped room. His green eyes were losing the spark they once held onto for so long. The ex-pro hero was sleepless, and Tom felt it on the inside as well. Tom, I'm sorry but I need to ask one more question. It's an emergency situation, the dark-haired male began, his eyes avoiding the screen. Is it possible to go back in time twice but end up in a different location? Asked Izuku, his eyes finally met Tom's. The American male's eyebrows furrowed, his head tilting slightly at the question. What I mean is that, if I end up let's say in the morning, is it possible to reverse time again to go back into the previous day dash? No, the male spoke sternly, completely interrupting his friend as he stared right at him. Tom's hands clenched into fists and then released after a couple of minutes, before repeating the pattern. He began developing a bad feeling in his stomach, some sort of rumbling that only appeared momentarily before disappearing again. Izuku, I told you, a lot of it depends on your mental state. If you end up at a specific time, it is either because your mind is too unstable to be sure of what it wants. Or perhaps it is because you subconsciously feel like something was not done then and you want to change it. As Tom explained, he could see Izuku's expression becoming more and more distressed, the bouncing of his reflection indicating the male's foot tapping. So he decided to press on it. What happened? That question seemed to appear as both a curse and a blessing. Izuku, every time you reverse the time, I can feel it. He explained, and for some reason he then could see the change of facial expression on the dark-haired male's face. How his eyes averted somewhere else, how his teeth bit the inside of his own cheek, how the tapping was now faster. Izuku's head shook as he seemed to shift. Deku pushed against the wall, getting up on his feet before he straightened his legs and averted the weight of his body to fully stand up. The dark-haired male looked around the walls of the little janitor's closet. He shut himself in to temporarily gather his thoughts and have a little privacy before the cruel checkpoint would reach him and his friends. The male grabbed a nearby stool, turning it around and sitting more comfortably on it, hissing at the feeling of his bones stretching and aching. He rolled his shoulders as he sighed, his back clicking in the right places before he leaned forward again. His hands trembled as he held the phone in his hands. Tom could then spot another emotion which he covered in his eyes. The younger male squinted his eyes a little before he looked a little closer at the other male through the mirror phone. Izuku sighed, his head dropping to face the ground before he spoke. This time his voice was a little deeper than before. At first, I saw my friends all laying on the field before the academy. Most of them have been stabbed and massacred by the League of Villains, or more like one specific villain who had for some reason become incredibly strong and almost invincible dash. That's because it's your mental state telling you this information. Your brain is trying to put the blame on something about the information you are missing. It may not be true, however you don't know that. Tom interrupted his friend, but upon noticing Izuku's annoyed expression, his voice grew quieter. The dark green-haired male was annoyed with the constant reminders. Tom did have a point though. Izuku was separated from his friends again when his friends were killed. So he wasn't really awake or there to witness the scene of cruelty. As I was saying, I reversed time to try again. And this time I ended up in the morning of the same day. But something was wrong, so I tried to go back even more. Deku explained, visibly withholding information from the quirk user. He scratched his pale skin, which still had some scratches and bruises from the malnourished state of his own mind. And what was wrong, Izuku? Tom's voice was lower again, almost as if he tried to console his friend rather than provide him with any positive affirmation or encouragement. Izuku braced himself, his eyes averting away from Tom, who was beginning to feel the worry begin to take a toll on both of them. It was one of my friends. The dark-haired male took slow breaths, clutching the device in his hand as his heartbeat began pounding in his ears. Tom's eyes softened a little bit, but still stared with concern and consolation. At one point, she asked me something to do with why I have been acting differently since I arrived. And whilst we were getting attacked at one point, she asked me if it has to do with the downfall of the situation. Tom's eyes widened as he slowly began understanding what he was trying to convey. I didn't tell her what was specifically happening, but I did hint at the fact that something is happening. Just not the way she believes. The dark-haired male finally said it. He finally managed to get it out of his system. Deku. Tom's voice sounded a lot more dangerous than initiated. What have you done? I told you you're not supposed to say anything. Why didn't you listen? Tom paced around his room, his hands in his hair as fury and frustration grew within him. Deku had one job and he failed miserably, and now it was only going to be a matter of time before something drastic could happen. Not only to Izuku's friend, but to the whole timeline, if she had much of a role in the lives of others. Izuku gulped, guilt spreading through his body like a tidal wave, his vision beginning to zone out as the situation hung heavily above him. He knew he wasn't supposed to say anything to anyone, he wasn't supposed to allow anyone to know this information, and he let it slip. Now, Uraraka may never be the same anymore. The dark green-haired male felt so alone in this situation, and how was he supposed to save others when he could not even say a single word about time travel? Not to mention he still could only see others in the distorted forms he encountered before the light in their eyes was forever gone. The ex-pro hero simply ran out when he heard the scream, running out of the building to see Uraraka, Kaken and Kirishima lying dead on the ground. He remembered how his vision began altering again, the distorted images in his head changing and adapting to the current state in which he saw the trio, dead on the ground. Katsuki and Injire's throats slashed, only a small part of their skin attaching their heads to their dead and motionless bodies. Uraraka laid right next to them, her chest being pierced with one of the training skeleton-like rods. And only then Izuku finally saw the face of the friend, but it was a reaction far from satisfaction. One of her eyes was brown, loveless but back to normal. Whereas the other eye looked more blurred, the pupil was barely visible as the color drained from it. Izuku reversed time before any other villain could get to him, appearing in the corridor, just a second before Uraraka left him with his own thoughts. The image vivid before him when he called out her name and grabbed her elbow. For a moment he thought he would see a change. Now he didn't see the blood running down her neck, but a metal rod move right into her chest. For a moment he felt a sparkle of joy, simply to know he would be able to see her actual face. But when she turned around, he felt a paralyzing sensation run through his body. Her left eye was covered by an eye patch, the skin around. It sore and red from all the rubbing and scratching. Izuku, what you just did, you don't understand, the impact from this timeline is basically making an impact on all of the timelines. Losing her vision in one of her eyes is nothing for now, she could permanently disappear, cease to exist. Don't you understand? Tom pinched the bridge of his nose. Deku, however, felt his eyelid twitch as his friend mentioned how the current situation was nothing. His friend's visual impairment was nothing. Deku had to physically let go of the phone to make sure his hand would not crush it. He felt anger boil up in him, slowly beginning to think that Tom had no idea what it was like to lose someone. To mourn something. I am losing her, his voice began breaking. I am losing everyone that is there to me all over again, Tom, and I don't know how to prevent this anymore. The dark-haired male's voice rose up, more than expected. His jaw was clenched as he gulped, trying his best not to start sobbing once again. Tom looked at the reflection, his eyes meeting Izuku's, however his expression did not change. He then walked up to the desk and sat before it again, his expression was stern. And you knew before? He asked, not expecting an answer to this question. However, upon observing the face of the hero, he slowly began doubting his statement. Did you? His voice softened as he leaned back. Deku looked down at the floor, his foot tapping. He hesitated before answering once, trying very hard to not get control over the situation. No. Tom, however, did not believe him, his face hardening as he leaned forward. Izuku, he began in that tone which slowly drove Deku insane. I told you, the timeline is heavily influenced by your mental state. If there is a blockage or any sort of resentment, the timeline will fight back against your consciousness. In the timeline you are in, you are the enemy. Tom raised his voice, his hands gripping the edges of the desk as his eyes drilled right into Izuku's face as he consoled him. Suddenly, Deku's hair began floating in the air, red veins appearing on his face as his eyes started glowing in green. His eyes widened, still staring at the ground as the memories of his friends dying in front of him flashed right before your eyes, his quirk activating once again out of impulse rather than on call. One factor he should have taken control of by now. His breathing fastened as his eyes began slowly tearing up, his breathing hitched as the uncontrollable sobs began slowly getting just a little louder. One of his hands instinctively covered his mouth, tears threatening to spill down his cheeks as he tried so hard to contain his emotions. So hard to prevent anything going wrong again. Every mistake was at the cost of the lives around him, every single error caused another round of pain following. And now, Uraraka lost the sight in the eye he was not able to see properly for so long without feeling the dreadful guilt that climbed up his back. The eye patch covering half of her vision, she was hurt because of him. This would not have happened if it was not because of Izuku Midoriya. Tom noticed the outburst Deku was now trying to battle, and moved back in his chair. He felt ashamed of causing the older male to enter an anxiety episode. But the younger male could not help his mind but to wonder about something. To must have pulled the trigger which could be the answer to the main problem. What caused the deaths during the final battle? Tom kept on staring at the mirror, his eyes softening as he looked at Izuku. I'm sorry, I should not have been so forward. I just want to help you. He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. His eyes glanced down at his hands, taking a deep breath before further talking, allowing the other male to take deep breaths and slowly recover as he listened to Tom's voice. You aren't the first person to time travel thanks to my quirk. And so many times I have explained to other users the rules and the seriousness of the situation only to get ignored. And every time everyone is going through the same situation and the same problem. Izuku's breathing began slowing down, his eyes looking up at Tom as the red marks round his body slowly faded. Tom continued, everyone wants to fix the problem, but nothing will get better if you do not understand the root of the problem. Otherwise, time will be heavily influenced by your consciousness. Any blockage, any sort of gap in your intentions, will cause the timeline to try and fill itself with the information based on your current state. Deku's breathing slowed down, the tears fell down his cheeks but they were quickly wiped away with his hand, making sure that he still held the phone firmly in his other hand tightly. Deku took a deep breath when he looked up at the screen again. What did the others try to do? Asked the dark-haired male, somehow finding comfort in Tom's voice. The younger male nodded understandingly. Well, they mostly tried to redo their tests at school, tried to impress a friend or a crush, or hide something away. Or win an argument, he explained, causing the other male to look almost baffled. Those problems seemed amateur, simple errors which could be done in a blink of an eye. You would be surprised how quick they failed and ended up getting worse, purely because of their inner intentions. Tom chuckled, looking back at the almost hilarious mistakes. His gaze averted down, almost as if in solemn. And no one listened to me, no one tried to firstly analyze the main cause, but it seems like you do, Izuku. Those words paralyzed Izuku as he started right into Tom's eyes through the device, his hands freezing as his blood ran cold, paralyzing him. Tom was now serious, but understanding was still in his nature. You were triggered by my words. You seem to have found the real cause, didn't you? Izuku took a deep breath, staring at his hands as he realized that the other male was right, and the answer was right before him. It's my fault, he finally choked it out. I killed everyone that day, and every single other timeline. I am the cause of the deaths on the battlefield. Izuku collapsed on the ground, his hands grabbing Kaken's head which barely clung to the rest of his body, the lifeless eyes staring into the nothingness. His hands were shaking from the sight before him, the high-pitched sound blocking the screams and the sudden bursts happening around him. He failed again. His eyes looked up as he noticed a shadow coming up closer and closer to him, the sunlight being blocked by the dark clouds in the broad daylight. He gritted his teeth upon the realization of who was coming up to him with a wide and dangerous smile. A sense of mockery written all over her face. Deku felt his vision turn red as he saw Toga come up to him with a knife. Well, and here I thought heroes are supposed to save their loved ones, not abandon them, she hummed as her steps got quicker, her smile wider and her golden eyes started glowing dangerously. But Izuku didn't care. Before Toga could jump at him with her needles and her syringes, Deku's hand rose up, his finger bent backwards as his thumb covered it. He snapped it with the speed which others would only see Ida move in, and the force of the attack shocked not only the students, but the villains around as well. Izuku's body fell on the ground, his middle finger bruised and bent back abnormally as his face fell first on the ground, his body aching. Not just in his arm, but he felt a paralyzing pain going down his whole body. His eyes shut tight as he hit the ground, the pitching in his ears getting so loud he was unable to hear his own whimpering and gasps of air. He forced his eyes open, his arms grasping the ground, his whole weight supported on his arms as the pain electrified on every single muscle in his body. When his eyes finally looked up at where Toga stood before him, what his eyes saw shook him to the core. Toga's body was dismantled everywhere, or at least what remained of her body. Her legs laid flat on the ground, blood coming out of the wound which appeared to be ripped apart from the rest of the body. There was a blood pool right in front of him, extending to the building before him, with the front wall completely missing. The wires and pipes coming out as the furniture inside it was shattered, the people inside laying on the ground or being as if stuck to the walls and the ceiling. Red painted all over the hole that went through to the other side, a broken tree in half with the fence destroyed. Izuku stared at the horrific sight before him, the cause of his own actions. His whole body was paralyzed as he finally understood what had been happening all those times when he tried to save his friends. She looked at his hands that were trembling, still gripping the grass underneath him with his dear life. The guilt came back to him in a way that crashed for his whole body, the final realization finally setting into him. The memory of the final battle, the attack in the class, the field run, all of these attempts tied in by one singular quirk. His quirk. The dark-haired male finally understood. He began understanding what happened to every single time. His power unleashing, evolving into something horrific and murderous. This time, it was as if his body was on autopilot. His hand grabbing his phone and pressing the button to go back in time. This time he did not even close his eyes as he felt the wind begin to swirl around him, the gravity pulling his body in whilst his vision got dark. And piece by piece the world around him disappeared into nothingness. This led him to finally turn off his phone. Looking up at the ceiling of the janitor's closet, he closed himself in. Tom's voice disappeared as Izuku finished the call, the reality setting into him. He didn't even let Tom finish before he dropped the phone from his hand and disconnected the connection. He took a few deep breaths, his mind running short circuits as he thought of all the deaths, all the mistakes he committed as he thought he was trying to save everyone. He felt lost. His mind felt blank as he tried to think of anything that could still hold some sort of hope or even a spark of possibility that he could save, but Tom's words played on loop in his brain. In the timeline you are in, you are the enemy. If he was the enemy, how was he supposed to save his friends? He looked at his hands once more, the feeling of dread and guilt now prominent in his mind as it crawled around his head like a giant spider, preying on its food. His face sank into his hands, his knees coming up closer to his head as he curled up, desperately wanting to disappear. He was supposed to be a hero, and to become a hero, an individual needed a quirk. But what if the quirk was the reason behind all the suffering? The sounds around him all seemed to blur into one, his vision beginning to blur. He felt numb. Even in distant conversations and sudden explosions behind the doors was no longer anything that he felt alarmed by. The screams that echoed in his brain were already drilled so far into his consciousness that he no longer distinguished them to be a sign of danger. His eyelids felt heavier with every moment, as his hand gripped the phone in his hand and once again pressed the button to go back in time. Routine. Something that Izuku grew to slowly hate, because it reminded him of the one thing he was trying to avoid at all cost. Even now, surrounded by the friends who were temporarily laughing with joy and chatting about nothing, he felt no different to how he felt after the fight. After everyone wished to erase their abilities that reminded them of the massacre. That hollow feeling of loneliness which engulfed him and slowly digested him so slowly it was becoming painful. And that pain soon became a routine that filled his body and mind with the feeling of helplessness. Living in the purgatory he dived into willingly. But even now, after all the attempts, he did not regret his actions. Through the laughs and the chatter, every single mistake, every single body that would fall to the ground, exhaling the last breath that escaped their lips would be followed by Deku grabbing his device and pressing his fingers so hard against the button, his fingers would turn white, with the red glowing veins beginning to appear. And within a matter of seconds, he would find himself discarded somewhere in the vasts of time. But there was still hope. Every time Izuku came back, the message on his phone would be the same. The pop-up notification flashing before his eyes, reminding him of the detail he firstly thought of as merely useless, only to soon gain meaning which brought hope back in his eyes. Time reset activated. Remember your place, and good luck. This message at first would annoy the dark-haired male, but it still caused him to check the time and the date of his current location. And with more and more backtracking, he realized one crucial thing. Even if he was going back in time, he was somehow still going forward. When he first arrived it was March 12th. Then by the second time, it was the 18th. And even if it had been only hours since he time traveled, he would still appear later than before. And somehow, every time he had a safe time, which would be a few hours, or if he was lucky, days before the class would be attacked by the League of Villains. That was it. Deku felt another wave of hope ignite his heart, his excitement beginning to brighten his expression on his face. All he needed to do is to somehow slowly get through to the last day and ensure that his friends would not die. He wasn't sure on how he was going to do this, but as for now, he was too alive to think about the numbness he was experiencing just a minute ago. He grabbed the phone from his side pocket as he desperately fiddled with it to see what was the current date. His eyes flashing at the information displayed before him. May 23rd. He took a deep breath as the pounding and the high-pitched noise were no longer audible. He sighed as he knew that it would not be easy, and to be honest he was dreading the next time another attack would be caused his perspective of his friends to alter before his eyes. But he was finally getting somewhere. He was getting closer to his goal. And though he was exhausted, though he felt guilt still rise within him, he wasn't going to give up just yet. Honestly, to others it only felt like a few months. But to Bakugo, somehow, when his eyes lingered for a little longer on the green-haired male, he could sense that something clearly was happening with him. And not just one event, it felt like something continuous was following his trail. Like some sort of a shadow which he would never escape into a reality where everyone's dreams were a reality. At first the blonde male thought he was paranoid, especially since Deku got his quirk surprisingly after everyone assumed he was quirkless. He thought it was just his stupid eye-mistake he committed in the past materializing in front of his eyes in a flash he so desperately wanted to cover his vision from. However, this time even he noticed how different the usual optimistic broccoli head was. And to be honest, the male was incredibly paranoid. He was often reluctant to ever bring up any sort of discussion about how he really felt about others. However, that did not stop the male from constantly staring at the dark-haired male and wondering what was the actual reason behind this ridicule. He even stopped using his own quirk, even during training, which honestly began slowly weirding the whole class 1A out. Eventually, Bakugo had to be patient. Whether he wanted it or not, he needed to confront him. He sat the whole English PRD in his chair, his fists tightening, threatening to set out explosions which would distract anyone around. Not to mention that DMN teacher who would use those idiotic scarves around his neck to strain him down and make him do something as a payback. The last thing Katsuki needed to hold him back before Deku would disappear from everyone's view once again. He did that often now. Even Icy Hot mentioned how he did not see him in the gym during training hours, not to mention how Sweet Cheeks was unable to get any sort of conversation out of him. Bakugo felt his teeth gritting when he thought back to the brunette coming into the dorms, her head hanging low as she mentioned Deku not wanting to talk. But that was the first time Bakugo noticed tears in the corner of the brunette's eye, her eye patch gaining a wet patch which she was desperately trying to hide. He didn't like it when she was crying, no matter how much he pretended like he didn't care. Even Bakugo remembered how as soon as his red eyes landed on Kirishima, both of them seemed to be sharing the same emotion. The red-haired frowned when he noticed Uraraka's quiet demeanor and see how desperate she was to disappear from the view of everyone in the dorm room. Even if Izuku was never one to cause someone to cry intentionally, Bakugo needed to know what was going on. He wasn't going to be played around with the other extras in some sort of a guess what. He had enough. As soon as the class was dismissed, Bakugo kicked his own chair back, causing the desk before him to hit Kirishima's chair. The male was shocked at first, froze for a moment, but did not question his boyfriend's behavior. Some things are better left behind. Bakugo stood up and quickened his own pace, walking after the dark-haired male who once again left the class in a rush. Katsuki almost ran after him, cursing under his breath that he had to fasten his pace because Deku pretended to be in some sort of DMN phase. Once they both had reached the corridor, and the other students were missing or nowhere to be found, Bakugo's voice rose. "Deku!" he snarled, catching up to the dark-haired male. He stood directly behind him, his arm reached out just to activate his quirk near the other male's head to catch his attention. "What the hell are you doing, you extra? Why the F? Are you acting like you're better than everyone else in this Demon Academy?" His voice was as raspy as always. However, unlike what the blonde boy initially expected, Deku did not turn around. He barely fell injured when the explosions blasted right behind his head. He simply stopped and looked forward. And though their eyes have not met, Bakugo felt a tinge of uneasiness trickle down his spine. "An extra, you say?" asked the dark-haired male, chuckling weakly, still facing away from the blonde. His shoulders slumped down, his head shaking a little. "That's a bit much, even coming from you," he snapped back before once again trying to take a step forward. The blonde boy, however, felt anger rising in him, realizing that for some reason Deku have no intentions of actually listening to you. Bakugo suddenly grabbed his hand, wiping away the sweat against his trousers before he proceeded. Their eyes met for a second, and this was the first time Bakugo almost gasped. He saw a lifeless glow in the green eyes that once were filled with so much life and so much hope. Now, they were nothing but a hollow vessel for the soul which was missing. Katsuki froze as his red blood eyes stared right into the green and lifeless orbs of the classmate. He felt his blood run cold upon seeing the final image of his mental stability falling into pieces. Deku looked at his arm that was being held and gripped by the blonde male, and eventually he rolled his eyes, snapping his wrist away and turning around to walk away again. Bakugo snapped back into reality, his fist tightening as he looked dangerously at the friend that was walking away. "Don't you dare to walk away from me," snapped to the blonde male. Once again, it didn't make much of a difference to Izuku Midoriya, who even though I was walking away, he muttered but loud enough for the other male to hear. "Not everything is your DMN business, Kakin." Upon hearing those words, Bakugo suddenly had some sort of a grip tighten around his heart, making it impossible for the male to think straight. "Izuku, stop, goddammit." The dark-haired male stopped in his tracks, taking a step back and turning around to look once more at his rival. His green eyes were filled with shock and curiosity upon the hearing his old classmate finally addressed him with his actual name rather than a nickname that was caused to degrade him. For a moment or two, there was no explosion murder. For a moment or two, there was no Deku. Right now, it was those two little kids again that played in the playing field pack after reception. It was those two little kids again dreaming of one day becoming the best heroes known to the human race. Right now, it was only Katsuki and Izuku. Unfortunately, even moments like these do not last long. They disintegrate into dust as time goes by and the clock keeps on ticking. Deku eventually looked down at the floor, his hands rubbing against each other as he began turning away. His voice was sounding as ever, boring, repetitive, and monotonous. And yeah, a side hinge of an emotion seemed to be hiding behind the walls. He was so desperately trying to build up and never allow anyone to take them down. "Calling me by my actual name?" he asked, no sort of nickname coming out of his mouth. "You're becoming soft. Might want to work on that." And with those final words he turned around and immediately towards the main door of the UA Academy. Bakugo stood paralyzed in the middle of the corridor, his eyes watching as the green-haired male left for the door, now feeling disappointed in himself knowing that he was unable to change the perspective of a friend he wanted so well. His red eyes looked down at the floor beneath his feet, contemplating whether what he had just done was the right thing. Perhaps he was wrong. Maybe you should have allowed Deku to deal with everything by himself. Upon returning to his storm, Bakugo quickly grabbed his chair, and with his anger and rage, he activated his work and broke it down, shredding it into billions and billions of pieces. Eventually, he had done the same with his own desk, destroying the furniture and causing a massive havoc in his room. He felt something begin to sting his eyes, a lump forming at the top of his throat, when he sniffed. Eventually, when he didn't hear, the door to his room opened. Kirishima peeked inside as he heard the various suspicious sounds coming from the room. His eyes widened, running quickly to his own boyfriend and hugging him from behind, stopping him from causing more mayhem. At first, he struggled. However, eventually he finally allowed his own walls to come down, and eventually his own head was leaning against Kirishima's shoulder as he cried into his boyfriend's shirt. He was a fool to ever leave behind. Midoriya, do you understand that what you're asking me will have a major impact on the hero course? Aizawa's gaze was stern, his expression however conveyed a sense of shock. Out of all the students in the class, Aizawa knew that Izuku always stood out from the rest of the classmates, especially due to his dedication, his declaration and determination. However, now staring at the student who was once so bubbly and optimistic, smiling at the world had brought a sense of dread through the teacher who was once reluctant to let Izuku train for the hero course in the UA Academy. Seeing the sudden shift in the student's behavior at first did not really bother the homeroom teacher. However, when he noticed that Izuku began using his quirk to a minimum during training, actually barely using his quirk, all might seem to be somewhat ignorant to this information, which genuinely surprised Aizawa. However, he reckoned that under this whole entire act was a person that was going through some internal conflict, and it would be better to leave them alone. He could only support his student. The teacher said as he turned to his desk and sat down on the chair, the scars around his neck and almost swallowed his face. Though to Izuku he looked like he was being strangled even more as his purple face only seemed to be reduced from color even more. And a massive hole in the chest that was still dripping with blood that seemed to flow. If you're not complete the work experience, you will be behind and you will have to stay another year. I would say, have another think about it. His tired voice said. The dark heart student was still looking down without even meeting the eyes of his teacher. He simply turned around and left the classroom as quietly as he came in. I knew that after facing villains, those who claimed that they wanted to become heroes would often begin to question their morals, and sometimes would even drop out or change to another one. However, this was the first time where someone who had a very particular outcome was deciding to fall back on the studies, rather than aim high along with the rest of the class. However, he decided not to think of it now. Perhaps maybe when the other teacher bring this up too, that's when Aizawa should probably start worrying as well. Meanwhile, Ochako, Mina and some other students from Class 1A were sitting in the lunch hall, wondering what was with their friend that once again has avoided them and walked right past them to the dorms. Uraraka fiddled with her small lunch pack, playing with the slices of fruits that she had been saving up. However, once again she had no appetite. Her thoughts were constantly orbiting around her fellow classmate. And even if last time he told her to leave him alone, and though she came back from the conversation almost in tears, she still knew that whatever Izuku was going through would somehow have an impact on everyone else. Mina, however, giggled, her expression smug as she once again believed that she caught another piece of evidence. The brunette looked at the pink-skinned girl in confusion, not very understanding her. "Sue, how is Deku and Oka?" asked the acid court girl. Her eyebrows were wiggling, and her smuggle was evident to everyone. "Did you manage to talk to him?" she asked once again, putting an emphasis on the word, talk. The brunette shut her eyes as she was fighting the urge to scream at her friend. Once she did, she had shared an affection towards the green heritage boy. However, eventually with time she realized that this was not what she was looking for. However, they did not stop her from worrying about Deku. Tsuyu's eyes were flickering between the two girls, sipping on her juice as she blinked a few times. "Mina, you shouldn't probably tease her this much," the frog girl replied, not really being a fan of seeing her two friends arguing over something so small. Besides, she knew that some things were better to not be dwelled upon. It's rude. Oh come on, I'm just messing with her. Mina giggled, her laugh causing Ochako to grip her small bag in her hand tighter. Her frustration was beginning to slowly rise, but she knew the only way to cool down would be a long hour of training. She wouldn't want to suddenly outburst on all her friends. Ochako took a deep breath, shaking her head. She was always very fond of her friends, and always reminded them of how important they were to her. However, some things, even Mina, were too much. And her teasing only seemed to be irritating rather than playful. Soon some of the Baku squad, Kirishima and Katsuki at the back holding hands. They walked up to the three girls that were sitting down by the table and smiled at them. The red eyes of Kirishima gazed at the brunette a little longer. Did you guys hear about Midoriya? Asked Denki, leaning against the table. Tsuyu and Mina looked up at the group, their eyebrows following as they seemed confused, but soon Mina's smirk returned. I'm sure Uraraka did, she teased as her black eyes looked towards the brunette, her eyebrows wiggling again. Ochako wrote her eyes, pinching the root of a rose as she then looked at the rest of the gang. What's going on this time? She asked, adjusting her eye patch, rubbing the area underneath. Apparently he's not taking part in their work experience, Siro explained, scratching the back of his head. The girls looked shocked at the blackhead boy. Not taking part? But isn't it mandatory? Asked Tsuyu, her wide green eyes flickering between all the members of the gang. Bakugo locked down without a word. She must squeeze his hand for reassurance. He was well aware of their last encounter. Ochako's eye briefly met their eyes as she took a deep breath. Seems like she wasn't the only one who was pushed away by him. As the months went by, as the training continued, the classmates of 1A have all noticed this change in Izuku Midoriya. Of course the teachers were able to see his lack of confidence during the work experience, however, for some reason he was able to always make it up during school time, and was able to fight any violence without having to use his quirk. Honestly, to some it seemed incredibly suspicious, and to others somewhat unsettling. But for some reason Deku was able to get by. And that is what mattered. Izuku soon gained a habit. His fingers and his thumbs would brush the middle of his palms, as if to calm down his nerves, ground himself. The training was tougher now that he had to physically force himself to use his own quirk. And he could feel the side effects. His body began slowly aching, the red veins appearing on his body, slowly beginning to pulse under his skin with a hot sensation that almost burned his muscles. It was not painful at first, however it was fairly uncomfortable. The dark-haired male knew that using his quirk could potentially call upon danger, and the last thing he wanted was to go back in time again. Even if the timeline would not throw him back to his initial appearance, he still aimed to get as far as possible. However, once in a while he had to hide the pain, he had to hide his internal screaming. And just like the ringing in his ears, just like all the images that haunted right before his eyes, he could not control that slipped out of his fingers. Even if he was the one supposedly controlling when to go back in time. His breathing was heavier when he was alone, trying to control his own pain. But the voice of Tom constantly was ringing inside his head like a bell. You are the enemy. So, perhaps if his quirk is the reason that the others were hurt in the first place, it would be better to calm it down? Midoriya grabbed the phone from the counter, ignoring the notification and the date he was usually staring right at whenever he picked up the device. He opened up the message about the work experience and the internships at the laboratory just a few miles from the academy. He started glimpsing through the article, staring at the pictures of the scientists and their experiments on the recent medications and antidotes to quirks which were implemented from the villain attacks. Perhaps there is an antidote to his quirk? Izuku placed his phone down, staring at the ceiling, thinking of all the outcomes which could aid him as much as possible. If he were to potentially at least lower the power of his quirk, he would be able to use it without causing any permanent damage, and could hopefully keep on going through the timeline. But first, he would need to sign up to work at the laboratory. It was time to enroll in the internship. Izuku was never good with excuses, and yet Aizawa was not someone to care enough for that. Shortly after Izuku read over the article, this time thoroughly, he went back to Aizawa, asking him to help him in the enrollment to the laboratory. The homeroom teacher was a little skeptical at first, especially soon after he just had a conversion in regard to the missing forms to complete the mandatory work experience. However, he was glad to see that Deku was once again slowly going back on the right track, even though he did not show it. Shortly after the documentation was filled out and the referral was done, the young male found himself standing in the main reception of the laboratory. His eyes, though peeking under the longer bangs he now wore, scanned badges of the interns, wondering if there was anyone who could help him. He knew that no scientist would randomly allow a student in the lab block and fiddle around with the medicine foolishly. Shortly after, a man in a long lab coat walked towards the small group, eventually calling everyone and grabbing their attention. "Hello everyone." He wore a warm smile on his face, looking at every single person individually, greeting them. The other interns gathered around him, paying their full attention. "I'm one of the scientists in this lab, and I'll be your guide for the next couple of days before you guys will be directed to the field of your choice." "Oh, maybe it won't be so hard after all?" The instructor asked some relatively understandable questions. Where did the interns come from? What are they best at? What are they looking for from this work experience? Soon they were being escorted around the whole building with some background to certain projects. Izuku was not as interested in the project, even if hearing about heroes was always something he would go absolutely obsessed with. His eyes, however subconscious, kept on eyeing the badge that was attached to the scientist's lab coat, dangling and jiggling with every single step. He knew he would be in serious trouble if he would simply take it and make a run for it, but as of now he did not even have a proper plan, let alone know what to do to avoid the deaths in the end. Eventually, during the route, the interns were allowed inside one of the laboratories under the name of Tsubasa, and Deku almost felt his whole body freeze. He stopped in his tracks right before the laboratory, the ringing in his ears returning as the image of the villain appeared before his eyes. The one who was behind so many deaths and experiments with quirks on that fatal day. That doctor that revealed his quirklessness. Izuku's vision began getting darker with every breath, his heartbeat pounding in his ears as he desperately tried to calm down. But at the same time he did not want to appear crazy in front of the other interns. Soon he felt a warm hand on his shoulder, gently squeezing his muscle. Izuku's exhausted eyes glanced up, noticing the scientist that walked them around the lab. He looked at him sympathetically. "You good, buddy? Do you need a minute?" he asked, his voice calm and collected as his dark amber eyes showed warmth which had washed Izuku with a sudden sense of déjà vu. Deku took a deep breath as his hands reached for his pockets again, wanting to hide his trembling hands. Only then Deku realized this was the first time he was actually taking in the features of the scientist. Pitch black hair tied in a ponytail, and dark amber eyes, resembling fire and the rust Izuku seemed to remember from somewhere. The male was at least a head taller than Izuku, not to mention how slender the man appeared. Yeah, I'm okay, mister." Izuku's eyes squinted as he tried to read the name of the scientist. The man, however, simply smiled, patting the shoulder he squeezed beforehand. "Professor Taylor's," the man smiled, chuckling a little, realizing that the dark-haired male probably had not heard his name properly before. Izuku's little smile almost faded, but only waited for the male to turn around and keep on presenting in front of the interns, before his face suddenly expressed a little hopeful smile. He thought to himself, sighing as he finally connected the dots, and the answer came right before him. Tom would give anything just to see his father once more. Looking around the laboratory, Izuku saw the scientists handle some medicine, testing it out and recording their findings, some having to explain to others. Here we have some of the antidotes recently discovered to prevent losing of abilities or blockage of quirks. Izuku overheard one of the scientists, quickly turning his head to the incoming voice, completely ignoring Professor Taylor's explaining the laboratory and the history of it. He stared at the group of the scientists, taking some bottles on the wooden stand and inspecting them, writing something down on the record sheet. And behind them, Izuku noticed a cabinet with a particular pill, behind a glass in a container. His eyebrows furrowed as he peeked over a little, trying to get a better look. He noticed Dr. Tsubasa walk over to the young scientists, grabbing the pill in his hand as if it was nothing. He showed it to his students, supposedly explaining. Izuku's head lowered. He knew that now his hair was darker, and perhaps now the doctor won't be able to recognize him, However, he still listened to the doctor explain the properties of the pill. Here, this pill is an antidote I call the ultimatum. As you see, it has incredibly strong properties as it is able to completely erase the quirk of the target. His gruff response was enough to cause amazement and interest amongst the small crowd around him. His hand rose up. However, the reason why it is so dangerous is because the quirk of the user will be affected as well, resulting in complete loss of abilities. Deku's eyes blinked as he listened deeply to every word of the villain. Was he trying to use it? He was definitely going to present it as an advantage in case one of his companions decided to go against each other. He would have full control. "Excuse me, young sir." Izuku almost jumped out of his skin, his eyes looking up as he noticed the intern group and the two guides looking at him in irritation and confusion. "We were about to leave. Are you ready to go?" asked Professor Taylors. His face showed concern. Izuku quickly nodded, walking along with the group. When he looked back at Dr. Tsubasa, he suddenly felt an intense gaze. Someone in the room gasped as they turned up the volume of the TV, catching everyone's attention. Izuku glanced at everyone and without thinking managed to squeeze behind every single person, following the wall behind and getting closer to the pill which was placed back in the glass container that was not even closed properly. Everyone stared at the screen, the news shocking everyone as gasps were audible. Izuku stood next to the glass container and slowly reached out for the handle, his hand slipping inside the crack to make sure no one heard his steps. The heroes are currently fighting for their lives against the League of Villains. The first class of UA Academy alongside the pro heroes are currently struggling against a villain that seemed to evolve. Deku froze. "No, it's today." No longer caring about being cautious, the dark-haired male grabbed the pill in his hand and ran out of the room, screams following behind him as the security tried to catch up with him. Running towards the exit door, he noticed guards and others running toward him, trying to stop him. He felt a knot in his stomach as he bent his finger back, but he knew he had no other choice. He managed just about to make sure no one was close enough to get hurt, and with the flick of the finger, a green blast exploded right in the direction of the door. Izuku did not even have the time to think about his next step, barely had time to check if anyone was around him, and tried to use his quirk to a minimum. And yet he needed to get there to the others. He was so close. Finally so close. In one hand he held the pill, and the other once again he flicked another finger as he aimed it down and jumped up. He gritted his teeth as he felt himself speed in the direction of the battlefield. His head was pounding, and yet he didn't care. He was so close. Finally! He would save everyone. When he managed to somehow slow down, his body hit the nearest wall. He winced in pain, and his eyes opened only to feel all the colors flash in his face intensely. The throbbing pain in his body only got worse as he limped forward. He looked up, breathing heavily. "It's okay, everyone. We can still dash." His eyes looked up, and the horror struck him again. His body froze when he saw the villains in front standing, tired and yet looking at him in fury, ready to strike at any second. However, it wasn't the villains that horrified him into the core. The bodies of his friends. Once again he failed them. He saw all of his classmates lying on the ground, large pools of blood surrounding their fragile and emotionless bodies, their hero costumes torn. And even if some of them had their eyes open, there was no light in them. The whole picture was still carried even from the first time he witnessed this massacre. Shigaraki, though his body looked horrifyingly mended and mutated, laughed as he saw in what state was the one known amazing student of UA Academy. "No," Izuku sobbed, shaking his head, the high-pitched noise once again coming back to his ears. The images of every single death flashing before his eyes, his red veins appearing all along his body as his quirk was almost impossible to control. "No, no, 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 no," he cried in agony. His hands grabbed his head as he felt his own hair begin to get carried by the wind, his quirk turning the hair into the light hue. His head was pounding. He failed everyone once again. With the corner of his eyes, he suddenly saw enraged Toga running at him with 2 knives in her hands, screaming. And as fast as he could, he stumbled back and grabbed the phone that was in his back pocket. He pressed the button frantically, begging out loud for it to work again. He cried, but suddenly he saw Toga jump at him, swinging her knife. Out of instinct, his other hand blocked the attack, only to suddenly scream as he felt the knife slash through his skin. He closed his eyes and hugged the device close to his chest. And soon he again felt the pain in his feet as he had all those times ago. His eyes opened, only to be met with the blazing sun in the sky reflecting off the windows of the UA Academy, once again standing tall and proudly. Izuku looked around desperately as he held the device, clenching it tightly in his hands as his breathing slowly calmed down. His eyes widened as he turned the device on, his eyes desperately looking for the date and the time. His breathing stopped. March 12th. Why was he all the way at the beginning again? Izuku had been standing by the bathroom sink for almost an hour now. Having washed his hands about 12 times, his face about 20 times, constantly needing to remain calm after the news. His eyes widened as the reality slowly came to him that he had once again arrived at the beginning rather than closer to the last point of time. He felt the whole world spin as the pitching inside of his ears only continued, his vision blurring with the water running down his hands, the skin wrinkling due to the water. His forehead was pressed against the cold surface of the mirror, and the dark hair which somehow now reached down to his shoulders, itching his face. He took a deep breath as his eyes closed. It would be a lie to say that he had grown accustomed to the feeling, and yet it seemed to somehow become more and more bearable with time, or at least the weight of reality did not hurt his soul as much. Even after he had just gone through hell a second time. His thumb ran over his moist hand, slowly tracing the lines of his hands which somehow were now more foreign to him with every time he pressed the diamond button on the device. His eyebrows furrowed, however, upon feeling some sort of a bump on his hand, being sure that it was definitely not there before. He opened his eyes and looked right at the deformation on his palm, looking closely at it. His head pulled away from the mirror, his back straightening and cracking in some places, reminding him of how slouched he had been. On his palm appeared to be a green pill, right under his skin which moved with the slightest movement or a poke on his skin. He blinked a couple of times before his eyes scanned the room around him and took a deep breath, his eyes locking with his own pitiful reflection he no longer identified with, but that was the last thing he worried about. Within a matter of seconds Tom's face appeared in the blue whirlpool which went against time. The black-haired looked at Izuku almost with pity, and yet a small smile still appeared on his face. Izuku, it's good to see you. His amber eyes looked directly through the dark green bangs of the once-known optimist. Midoriya felt a sense of comfort he had longed for all those months of trying and failing. Tom's eyes, however, saddened as he fidgeted with his hands. How can I help you today? To be honest, he had no idea what to say. He hadn't felt any sort of discomfort due to his quirk for a while, so he could potentially work out that Izuku failed. Tom, how's my mom there? Izuku's voice almost shattered, his eyes tearing up as he thought back to her smile and her kind nature. Even now, during the new timeline, he hadn't kept in contact with her. Thinking about his mom brought him guilt, instantly thinking about how she must feel in the original timeline, still waiting for him to return home. Tom sighed, scratching the back of his head as he looked away. I haven't spoken to her since you know. But I do sometimes see her around. And she's worried. She's visited the workplace about 10 times and still asks where you are. I try to cover you and say that we haven't been close enough for me to know what's happening to you, so I don't think they are suspecting anything, the black-haired boy explained, his fingers scratching the surface of the desk he sat by. Deku looked down, his eyes blinking hard and rapidly to allow his tears to drop away. He missed his mother, he missed her comforting embrace whenever he faced a terrible day. He missed her soft smile during those mornings before he went to junior high. He missed her gentle caress on his head whenever she praised him. He missed his mother, and he wanted nothing more than to come back to her arms and cry out how much he needed her right now. A sob escaped his lips as he wiped the tears away from his eyes, the images of his worried mother flashing before his eyes. Tom's eyes, however, quickly flashed towards his hand where the darker bump appeared, staring at it with confusion and alarm. Izuku, what is that on your hand? His tone came a little shaky, his back straightening. Midoriya looked at his friend before then staring at his hand and shrugging. I don't know, it was on my hand I think when I reversed the time again, he explained calmly, his eyes still examining the round-like object under his skin. He raised it up to the reflection so his friend could see it better, with Tom leaning forward a little to look at Izuku's hand better, his eyes squinting a little. Tom hummed, his eyes looking right at the hand of his friend before he suddenly gasped and reached over to a shelf next to his desk. Izuku noticed the male take out a notebook, placing it down in front of him on the desk and flicking through the pages frantically. His hand slammed down soon, reading the page his hand was on, as his eyes scanned the whole page. Izuku, what you have under your hand looks like one of the pills my father's mentor used to work on, but how would this be possible? What date is it in your timeline? Asked the black-haired male, his amber eyes looking intensely at the dark green-haired male. Izuku stuttered before he spoke. March 12th, he answered, and Tom started shaking his head. This pill was created at the beginning of May. This doesn't make sense, because even if you had been gone to the laboratory, you would not be able to take any objects with you other than the phone in your hand, Tom explained, his voice breaking as soon as the word laboratory came out of his mouth, the visible memory of his father in his mind. Izuku thought for a moment as his eyes looked at his hand, and a memory of his visit at the laboratory flashed before his eyes. His head suddenly looked up at Tom, the color letter returning slightly to his face. Before I had time to travel again, I remember feeling a pain in my hand. One of the villains ran up to me and slashed me there, and I think at the same time I was holding the pill, the dark-haired male started explaining, his eyes flicking from the other boy to his hand back and forth. Tom listened closely as he began nodding to every bit of information he received. He thought for a moment as he tapped his chin with his index finger. So, there is a chance that whilst the cut formed, the pill must have been either pressed against the wound or was possibly drained with your blood for it to merge with your body, I guess? The black-haired male explained, his eyes flicking back to the notebook beneath him. Deku looked at his hand again, his eyes staring right at the pill underneath his skin, now more cautious of the area. He tried to think back to Dr. Tsubasa's words, the properties of the pill and the effects of the ingredient. I think Dr. Tsubasa mentioned that ultimatum can take away the quirk of the opponent. I supposed it was only a one-time use? The green-eyed male added, his curiosity perking up with interest. Tom immediately nodded. I think my father once mentioned that it could only be used once, however not many wanted to experiment with it. People without quirks were not the best applicants, and individuals with quirks did not want their own quirks to be erased. Tom nodded again, his finger tracing the pages and the words written down, before stopping and tapping one spot 3 times. It could be that since the pill isn't damaged in any sort of way, you could still use it on the villains that took part in the final battle. Tom scratched the back of his head, looking away. Izuku blinked a couple of times, thinking out loud. I hoped that my quirk would become weaker. The thought now appeared as a distant dream, somehow the reality beginning to settle with Izuku. In the end, chaos and violence followed him since he has gained the quirk of All for One. The younger male took a deep breath. Hearing that statement coming from Izuku made him close down the notebook and slowly push it away from himself. His amber eyes met Deku's as he began fidgeting with his hands again. Deku, however, now somehow regained the remainder of his strength. His face remained exhausted but focused. I can only use it once then, one last time, he answered, his hand grabbing his phone momentarily. Tom's anxiety grew again as he raised his hand and touched the surface of the mirror to stop the green-haired's male action and catch his attention. Izuku, wait. Look, I know you want to save your friends, but I don't know what to say to your mom. She will eventually find out something is wrong, and from what I've seen, she's not doing well. Deku paused, his eyes staring at Tom, a lump forming at the back of his throat at the image of his mother appearing right in front of his face. Tom, however, continued, his gaze dropping down to his hands. What I mean to say is, deep inside, you don't just want to save your friends. You want to get rid of the very thing, of the roots of you wanting to become a hero. And I don't just mean your quirk or all might, but maybe somehow, the people that pushed you forward. Tom continued, Deku's eyebrows furrowed as he looked down, not exactly understanding. What do you mean? I mean, maybe the timeline is right? Maybe it knows what you really need, and maybe what you need is not for things to change and go back to what they were, but stability. Look, the next time is the last time you can contact me, and then you can either forever stay in the timeline you are in or come back to me, to us, to your mom. Tom's amber eyes finally looked up at Izuku once again, finally seeing the shock and withdrawal on Izuku's face, and yet he continued. Deku shook his head, closing his eyes as his hands gripped the sink. No, Tom. I know I promised you to find you in this timeline, and you need to understand that I will keep my promise. But I need to save them. They are my only hope. Izuku stood firm, his back straightening. The younger male's head shook as his eyes widened, not understanding the ex-pro hero's perspective once again. Only hope for what? He raised his voice, his breathing picking up as he noticed the male beginning to leave. Izuku's eyes glowed a little, before he took a step back from the mirror and headed towards the door to the hallway, muttering under his nose. My redemption. And with those words, he left the toilet stalls, hearing as the frantic voice of Tom faded along with the reflection, and the banging on the mirror surface coming from the other timeline. Tom banged the desk repeatedly, his fists reddening from the impact before he stood up quickly, knocking the chair back. His tears streamed down his face as he felt once again that dreadful feeling of disappointment which he should have been so used to by now. He felt as if his whole world was once again, the pressure building from all the sides and squeezing him so tightly it was almost suffocating to breathe. And yet in all the suffocation he was once again all alone. All those tremendous memories of flooding his mind as he kept on trying so desperately to reach for the light at the end of the tunnel. Tried to reach for the solution to his problem, and yet once again it seemed to be running away, turning away from him as he no longer had the control of his very being. Since Tom had first discovered his quirk, well, with the help of his dear and loving parents. His father, who was a scientist specializing in the evolution of quirks and their properties, and his loving mother who would always talk him through any of his worries. Most stopped seeing him as a human being after discovering his time travel abilities. Rather now, all saw only one thing in him, an opportunity. From a young age, people would come to him, begging him to use his quirk and send them back in time to make the minor changes. They would not be anything severe, a simple mistake or a problem which was slowly rising. And of course, in a heartbeat, Tom's smile would widen, knowing he could help someone once again. Hoping that perhaps after the deed would be done, whoever he helped would become close with him and become his friend. Unfortunately, every single outcome leads to the same conclusion. Every time, he would explain the rules of his quirk, constantly outlining the importance of the laws which tied in with the time travel. Luckily, the more severe rules were followed, but in the end it had not mattered. Tom remembered how many times he would meet the people who had fixed their problems in the past, how eagerly he would run up to them, hoping to hear them call him their friend. But in the end it was all the same. Some have pretended they had not known who he was, mocking his desperation as they laughed about his eagerness. Those disgusted faces if he even dared to mention their deal, and how they walked away, making up some excuses about running out of time or needing to be elsewhere. As if what he had done for them had never happened in the first place. Apparently gaslighting was the favorite of his opponents, especially when assuring him that he had never spoken to them in their sworn lives. And after the death of his parents, he never felt more alone in his existence. That was the first time he really began understanding how lonely he was. Even with all the people in the center running around, only having the room to himself for a few minutes maybe, he never felt the satisfaction of someone else by his side. And then along came Izuku. So, for the first time, he felt supported. Maybe that was due to the fact that he needed guidance and Izuku just happened to be the nearest person. Tom remembered the comfort he felt whilst being around the ex-pro hero, how safe and validated he felt unlike he did back in Michigan. Even though he never admitted it out loud, he was thankful that others no longer asked about his quirk, but that feeling would immediately tie back to the laboratory his parents were in. Their dead bodies lay on the floor, bleeding and lifeless. For the first time in his life, he thought that perhaps someone would finally want to stay with him, despite knowing what he was capable of. And maybe it was possible to find that point where nothing would change again, even in this messed up world which slowly started to lose logic and the laws of morality waited on everyone. The black-haired male curled up on his bed, his hands gripping his own hair tightly in his fists, his eyes shut as he felt his tears run down his cheeks. Sniffing, he gasped for air, but even then he felt as if he was suffocating. His whole world came crashing down once more, and now he could only hope that by the time Izuku contacts him one last time, he will make up his mind to come back. Back to where he belonged, at least that was what Tom believed. What he needed. Now, everything was going to go downhill. All Izuku had to do was to make sure he would not have to face any of his friends, though he slowly had become accustomed to the gore before his eyes any time he looked at his classmates. But even without the scars and the invisible pain of the others' endurance, Izuku no longer felt any sort of content from hearing their lively voices. He no longer felt happiness at the thought of success. He stopped imagining what it would be like to allow himself to smile and hug his friends after so long. Deku was losing hope, but this was not the beginning. He realized the process began before the antidote fused within his skin. Or even before he pushed the others away from himself. Deep inside, he knew that the change began as soon as his eyes opened to see Wei still standing. To hear the voices which were once nothing but a memory in his head, haunting him during those sleepless nights and during his everlasting nightmares which he tried to escape. But now, he felt like he had no more will to run. No more strength to fight or to keep going. Now his body was sleepwalking in his personal purgatory, whilst his mind was barely awake of the reality on which he drifted to. His friends, though he cared about them, no longer felt the closure to him they had before. Even if he reset the timeline once more, his classmates felt distant, as if his body was walking amongst the ghosts of the past, haunting him, rather than bringing the feeling of hope he had felt for so long. Now there was simply despair. Though everyone seemed to be themselves, one fact was evident. Somehow, the people in this reality were like pawns to the timeline, not understanding what was happening to the broken chest piece and yet still following their path. Even if they have tried to approach the dark-haired male, the only response they received from him was ignorance and avoidance of any questions. No conversations ever shared between them, even group work was somehow excusable for. The teachers no longer seemed to approach the young male, allowing him to take the battle by himself. Even All Might seemed to be going through a whirlwind of emotions any time the idea of Izuku being distant came up to his head. And yet nobody informed Inko, who was still at home, believing her son that everything was fine during the hero course. The time was going forward, and so was everyone else, whilst Deku had to silently go forward and guard everyone by completely detaching himself away from all the people he cared about the most, the ones who were the cause of why he traveled back in time. His eyes would often stare at the pill under his skin, as he formed a simple plan in his head. Though the steps of it were amateur, the actions taken were almost impossible for Deku to achieve the desired outcome. His dry eyes would stare at the ceiling in the middle of the night, the darkness of the room swallowing him whole as the dream of his friends living another day was more and more distant. His hand reached out toward a line that only got further away with every step he took, blinding him with its spark. His eyes no longer knew where to look, and yet his body dream-walked, marched forward without stopping. Some nights Izuku thought back to the words which came out of Tom's lips during their last contact between the timelines. The green-haired male's mind would reimagine the reaction of the younger male, his eyes, his expression. Though at first Deku was horrified by bringing it up in the first place, he did wonder what he would do back in his miserable life in the original timeline. How would his mother react if her missing son came back from the dead? How would he go by every day? But the realization would soon come back to him, the feelings of doubt and guilt crawling up his spine once again. If he ever returned to that life, no one would benefit from it. And though Tom did not understand it, Deku knew that he would eventually come to terms with it, in the future. He turned on the camera of his phone, taking a deep breath before he began recording his voice. Deku slammed the classroom door open, his eyes sharp and looked determined as he stepped inside. All the eyes of the Class 1A stared at him in confusion, shock and slight irritation, especially Bakugo, who still did not understand the audacity of the former optimist. Midoriya looked slowly around the room, his eyes staring into the faces of his friends, battling the urge to look away from the hallucinations he was constantly fighting with. He took a deep breath before he stepped inside, his arms handing at his side as he thought due to the inner script he formed in his head last night. Meanwhile others stared at him, surrounding Aoyama, who finally explained the truth behind his quirk and the story of what All for One had done to him. Ochako slowly stood up from her chair, her fingers fixing the eye patch she wore her whole life. Bakugo and Todoroki stood up as well, their gazes confused as well as withdrawn. Understandably, the bond between the classmates not as strong, with Izuku never being there for Shoto or others in the first place. He stared at Aoyama, the memory of the past lifetime slowly emerging before his eyes when Aoyama revealed to be the traitor of the UA Academy. He took a deep breath before speaking, his eyes fixated at all the bloody faces. "Look who's here," Mina muttered, still sitting at her seat as she hunched over, wanting to see the scene before her. Aoyama straightened a little, his fists clenching the fabric of his clothes tightly. "I know I haven't been exactly present recently," Deku began, his gaze dropping a little as he felt his own guilt hanging heavy above him. Not to mention how he could barely contain the reactions of others. "But we need to put an end to this. All of this. All from the betrayals, League of Villains, the isolation." He muttered out the last word, internally screaming as he realized how corny and cringy it may sound coming from his lips. Especially as he was believed to be not talkative at all, at least in this timeline. The others stared at him mostly in almost shock. It was rare for him to speak so openly in front of others, it was rare for him to speak to others at all. Bakugo felt his eyebrows furrow as his fists clenched, the red orbs of his stared directly at the dark-haired male. "Yeah, as if we hadn't come up with this before you bursted in," he snarled, stepping forward, only to suddenly feel the heart of Kirishima grab his shoulder to ground him. Deku felt his heart clench at the blonde's words, but he kept on reminding himself that this was not the worst he heard before. He looked down, feeling his motivation and his determination fading as the guilt ate him alive. "I know I haven't been exactly present," he began. "Present? Goddammit, Deku, where the F is that idiotic brat gone? The one who wanted to become a hero to save others." Bakugo walked up to Izuku once again, stomping toward him in anger, preventing Kirishima from grabbing him again. Deku, however, did not flinch, just stared at Bakugo unfazed as he waited for him to cool down before he continued his little speech, which seemed to fly out of his head, now purely improvising. "We need to put an end to the League of Villains, or things will only escalate from here. And the only way to win with them is to use the same tactics they had used on us." Izuku mentally cursed at himself, realizing he had jumped straight to the point, rather than firstly making sure he completely had gained everyone's trust as he initially planned. He looked up and saw how, though he could not make out the right expressions on everyone's faces, the atmosphere was thick, skeptical, and unsure. And he knew that perhaps he had been too late once again, but he needed to keep going forward. Pressing that button would not 100% guarantee him the opportunity to go back all the way to the beginning, not to mention he started feeling rather unsure if the timeline wasn't purposely playing tricks on him. "I know you guys don't trust me enough to call me your friend, to call me one of you. I know you all have tried to be there for me, even when I pushed you all away." Midoriya found himself at a loss of words, his mouth running dry as he simply decided to be outright and honest, not turning back or replaying. This was the reality he needed to face in order to go forward. "But the last thing I want is to know we failed because we were not sure of what direction to take to go forward, and unfortunately I'm afraid this is the only option we have left." The room felt silent, almost as if he was in it all by himself. No one uttered a word, however now their looks did not display any sort of disapproval, rather interest and determination which was not present before. Ochako took a deep breath as she turned to him, facing him fully as her brown eye met his tired expression. Her hands were intertwined, held closely to her chest. "I trust you." Those 3 words came out of her mouth, almost stinging Izuku right in the chest. His eyes were focused on her pale face, completely avoiding the fresh blood that had trickled down to her chest, bleeding over her uniform. Soon, the two heard something move at the best of the classroom. Kirishima stood up in his chair and walked closer to the two, clicking his knuckles as a determined look on his face appeared. "I trust you too," he answered, and soon the other members of the classroom, one by one, slowly stood up and looked at him with curiosity and yet with slight admiration. All smiled at him. Deku could see everyone slowly begin to open up to him. Any plan was better than sitting around, allowing the League of Villains to continue their crimes. However, there was still one more who needed convincing. Kirishima looked at his blonde partner who stood on the other side of the classroom. His expression turned to confusion and concern. He was about to step closer to Bakugo, only to feel Deku push past him and stand only a few steps away from him. A feeling he knew all too well washed over him as the two stared directly at each other, the tension between them getting thicker. "You extra," he scoffed. "You always give such big inspirational talks, always pretended to be so strong when on the inside you were nothing but a loser." The blonde-haired continued, his gaze sharp as always as his voice rose in volume. Deku only stood before him, his eyes fixated on Katsuki's expression like a mission. Kirishima felt the tension, so thick someone could cut through it. Ochako noticed how the red-haired male tried to walk up to his boyfriend to stop him from insulting anyone else. The brunette had a strong feeling to interfere as well, on one hand understanding the reasons behind Bakugo's commentary. And yet she did not wish to see her classmates argue. "Maybe that's the reason why you're fit to be a hero," he rolled his eyes, crossing his arms as his gaze softened only a little. The others stood still, not being able to comprehend what just occurred. Deku nodded, his eyes still looking at the red-eyed male. "So," Denki spoke up, breaking the confusing silence he was still trying to wrap his head around. "What's the plan then?" His voice caused everyone's eyes to flicker between a slightly still shaken Aoyama and Deku, who turned to face everyone in the classroom. "We need bait, and we need to lure the League of Villains out of their hiding. When they work separately, they are easier to take down. Therefore separation is the key. And we need to make sure we know who we are tackling, but we need a tactic too." Deku blurted out the last part. He thought back to the original timeline, remembering how when he was unconscious and everyone was around him, they were laying dead on the ground, and it was all because of him losing control. "What's the tactic then?" Mina stood up as well, the blood pouring down from where her arm used to be before Deku completely obliterated her. Izuku took a deep breath, knowing the results and the possible effects which could potentially destroy him on the inside, but he knew he needed to keep it away from others so their existence would not disappear completely. "It's hidden. I need to make sure that we are completely ready in case something goes sideways," he explained, his eyes briefly staring at his closed hand. He knew his main goal to finally stop this madness would be simple: defeat Shigaraki. Nobody was prepared for this fight enough like Izuku Midoriya, and yet if the world was to hear his opinion, he would silently admit to himself that he was just as unprepared as the others were. Just because he had lived through those events, it did not occur to him that it would be any easier this time. Not to mention how frightened he was, even if he was still blessed with the option to go back in time. And even if his mind was telling him to not hold onto the hope of ever finding the end of this purgatory, his heart was whispering to him that perhaps it would be his last trial. Although those whispers were distant, far-stretched, and very faint. Yet he still held onto the hope. He knew he had to. His mind was currently running in circles as his own feet ran towards the battlefield, the original place where Shigaraki and All For One were to meet, causing the villain and the victim to aim to destroy the life of many. His mind flashing, presenting him with the memories of the bloodshed that occurred, however he managed to push those thoughts down. Currently, his main objective is to get there in time. Bakugo's expression remained in his head, the head tilt and the unusual neutral expression presenting before his eyes, right before setting off. "Oi Deku, just don't lose your goddamn head." Those words did not seem to contain any source of comfort or reassurance. The other classmates even almost hissed at Bakugo as they heard of the accusations, but Deku could read between the lines. And even if no one else saw it too, the dark green-haired male could see the gaze of his old childhood friend softening as the words rolled over his tongue. To lose your head is one thing, having to gather up and go forward is another. Right now Izuku wished he could have used his quirk to get to the scene of destruction in time, or possibly to get there faster. But using his quirk would mean using it for the final time before permanently losing it. And he needed to save it. Save it for Shigaraki. And save everyone else, whilst he was so close to the final bow. The wind blew in the face of the green-haired hero, his long hair having to be clipped back just to give his eyes more view and perspective. His green glowing eyes now looking at his legs carried him through the broken building and the screams of the civilians who did whatever they could to ensure their own safety. He almost bumped into one of the people as they ran away, screaming at the top of their lungs. The male felt relief washing over him knowing that at least he was not sent to the island with Toga, remembering to hide from everyone else and jump out of the transportation in time to deceive the others in time. The lungs were aching for air as the muscles of his legs cried out for the rest he longed for. But he still needed a few more seconds for the torture to turn into fear and ultimately realize the final step. Finally reaching the place which brought him constant nightmare, he only then slouched down to take a deep breath. His eyes tearing up before knowing he had to look up at the scene before him, his body shaking at the thought of having to grab the device from his secure pocket and pressing the same button once more. His body was tired, he was exhausted. Izuku just wanted to go home. But it wasn't the end yet. He didn't know when the end would approach, the air in his throat beginning to expand the muscles, his eyes closing from the uncomfortable feeling it brought him. His eyes finally looked up, his breath escaping his lips more like a groan and a frustrated sigh rather than a calm breath. The sight of crazed Shigaraki, the supposed final form of his twitching and sparking with attacks to any little unknown particle falling on his body. Hunching over, his red eyes glaring at the victims which still stood in order to fight for the good and the future of humanity. This was it, the moment he lost his control and caused the deaths of many innocent lives. Deku's eyes glanced down, noticing the body of Bakugo slowly being lifted up by the other heroes, his broken bones now not aiding him in the situation he was left in. His green eyes staring at the heroes whose eyes had not met sleep in so long, whose bodies slowly betrayed their minds as they slowly retreated or stood up limping. Izuku felt his heart stop as he realized that this time the bodies of his friends were not laying on the ground. This time all of them were still alive. The relief splashing him like a puddle, and yet to him it was not something to celebrate yet. His eyes darted slowly towards the villain who was moving toward him, his body letting out sounds which would bring anyone else discomfort. The eyes of Midoriya stared directly at the upcoming danger, his posture standing tall and determined as his fists tightened, feeling the pill under his skin move around in the spare space in the tissue of his skin. Others, who he grabbed the attention of, soon stared at Izuku with worry, shock and soon shock at the realization that the hero was not moving away from the attack in the first place, only waiting for it to come at him. Katsuki's eyes widened, his voice shouting out loud the name of the hero he once used to be so skeptical of, his arm reaching out to the dark green-haired male desperately. His legs began to move, wanting to desperately stand up and run to him, sensing what was about to happen. But the others held him back, only allowing him to sink in the torture of watching the events unfold before his eyes. Shigaraki's laughter turned louder as his arms pounced up, his deranged limbs throwing to attack the young male, his smile turning wider as the victory in his subconscious was within reach. Deku did not flinch, he did not back down or step back upon seeing the limbs being thrown directly towards him. Instead, he turned his head towards the group of his classmates that looked at him in horror. He smiled, knowing he passed it. He passed the point in the timeline. They survived. He raised his arm, his wrist bent back. He did not look at his target, his eyes constantly at the ones he longed to see. His heart filled with relief, his eyes stung as the tears formed in his eyes, their screams of his hero name echoing in his mind. He smiled for the first time in what felt like forever, the puddle of relief beginning to rise as it soon became a tsunami the hero finally allowed himself to drown in. His eyes closed, the darker around him engulfing his vision before his wrists finally snapped with the four known to him, too familiar to distinguish. The peace washing through his mind within seconds, the final snap heard as the excruciating pain spread from his arm to his whole body. The darkness began to cause the world around him to disappear as the screams quietened down, and his senses died down. He did it, he saved them. Izuku Midoriya saved his loved ones. Shigaraki let out a painful howl as his body collapsed to the ground, the blast of the attack causing his limbs to deteriorate and fall down, almost motionless, the red eyes of the villain closing as the body turned back to a humanoid looking. Others stared at the blast in shock and fright, but as soon as the two bodies of the hero and the villain fell to the ground, another hero gathered all his strength and ran up with the remaining strength. Bakugo screamed out the name of his childhood friend, collapsing to his knees as he reached the body of the dark-haired male. Izuku! God damn it! His tears fell down his cheeks as his hands grabbed the body of the unconscious hero in his arms, picking his head and shoulders up, looking at him through the tears forming in his red eyes. The other reached the two heroes, some gasping at the sight, some calling out their names as they ran up. They all stared at the two students, one holding the other, the unconscious and the motionless friend who they now regretted turning away from at the beginning. Sobs were heard in the crowd as the realization of reality sunk into them. Katsuki gripped the body of the dark-haired male harder, each second more painful than the last. But to everyone's shock, a loud gasp for air was heard. And it was not anyone else around him. Deku took a sharp breath before his eyes fluttered open. Tom's eyes snapped open at the painful headache that appeared out of nowhere, causing him to grip his head. The pounding pain turned into a heart-gripping, boiling ache which held onto his brain and tightened with every second. His mouth opened, only to let out a quiet cry, sound more as a quiet wail which scratched his throat, like a hand digging its claws into his vocal cords. The young male never felt such pain before, no matter how many times he had sent someone into the past. It was unbearable, as if the essence of his soul was being pulled away from his body that was being ripped apart from all the sides slowly and agonizingly. The pain in his head slowly started dying down only a few minutes later, his eyes still shut tight whilst he was too afraid to open them in case the pain came back. He had to count every second, monitoring his own breathing as the air in his lungs began growing thicker. The knot in his chest slowly began to untangle, but it was still prominent. He gulped as his fingers still gripped his head, but he had to remind himself to let go. His quirk never affected him so badly before, hence why he felt even more anxious. The overwhelming fear did not help. Just a few minutes ago, his lunch came to an end. The gray sky only seemed to remind everyone at the construction site of the rain that was forecasted. And though it was certainly a difficulty, nobody seemed to care about it. Similarly, Tom, however, he had nothing to look forward to after work. His days turned into one monotonous cycle, unbreakable to anyone around him. Every face his eyes met would blur into nothingness, people around him becoming simple hollow shells that were too occupied with the events of the final battle to dream of a better tomorrow. He was all alone in the world, no one to care if he had disappeared. And within a second he collapsed to the floor with the pain hitting him with a length and strength he had never expected. Finally, the pain had stopped. The painful ringing inside his ears had paused as the world's tourney had died down and soon succumbed into nothingness. He still kept his eyes close, his hands in his hair as he let the ground underneath him harden in a second, and yet it appeared warm? Strangely warm and familiar. His eyes slowly fluttered open, the light around him almost blinding his eyes at first. He blinked a few times as his eyes adjusted to the atmosphere around him, the realization coming up to him slowly, and yet adrenaline in his body ran quickly. He was no longer outside. No longer caring for the headache, the male rose up, his head snapping as he looked around frantically. The room which he was in appeared horrifyingly familiar. His breaths turned short again, then the wooden floor under his fingertips was warm. But it was the least unusual thing. He hated when his bedroom was cold. He looked up at the bed, still sat on the floor as his eyes met with his own reflection. Unlike him, however, his reflection was sitting on the bed cross-legged. His brand new trainers, which Tom wore out quickly after the battle, now appeared brand new. His hair was neater, probably brandly washed. Not to mention that his skin color was a lot more prominent than now. The supposed reflection sat frozen on his bed. The bowl of soup stayed on his lap as his spoon was frozen midway. Their eyes met, both shock and confusion. However, the reflection appeared a little more frightened than the male sitting on the floor, looking up with its eyes like a hawk. That was, until the male sitting on the bed turned his head to the door and yelled as loudly as he could, dropping the spoon and the bowl on the floor. "Mom!" To pinpoint what Tom was feeling would be an achievement. Currently, she was trying to take whatever was happening around him. One of these things would be that he was sitting in the house I was supposed to be burnt after the final, with his supposed dead parents and his younger self staring at him. His mother's kind eyes were now, from what he could make out, conflicted. Her gaze switched from one version of him to the other every 5 seconds, not quite sure on what had happened. Her eyebrows, however, were knitted together, trying to fit in the puzzle pieces of the events happening. His father, however, was pacing around the table everyone sat at, his hands clasped together as his eyes looked at the ground. The lab coat still hangs on his shoulders, almost causing the older version of Tom to swallow down a sob. For the first time, he knew what it was like to be in the shoes of his own victims, people he set into the past with his quirk. Okay. Well, this is certainly what I would have ever expected. The gentle voice of his mother reached his ears. The male shivered in his seat as he held the tears back. She looked at her son and his supposed other variant, who looked almost malnourished. Your ability to send someone back in time seemed to evolve, finished Tom's father, coming up behind the other version of Tom, placing his hands on his son's shoulders as his eyes stared directly at the amber eyes of the older version. Something must have happened to cause such change in the timelines. Tom shook his head, still looking down as he tried to put the pieces together. But I did not train my quirk, I have been using it the same as usual, the male explained, conflicted. He heard a screeching sound as his father sat down in the chair opposite to his mother, both of them looking at the other version of their son in sympathy. Sometimes, our quirks evolve during a traumatic event in our lives. It's like a defense mechanism, it does whatever it can to protect you. Sometimes it means adjusting to certain situations, the mother explained, her eyes flickered quickly to her son, the younger version of Tom who was sitting quietly and observed the conversation with curiosity. She smiled and gently ran a hand through his combed hair, her thumb brushing his cheek. Her gaze then turned back, looking at her husband who continued the explanation. Or perhaps the timeline must have merged or adjusted. Because it knew something needed to be taken care of, he told the others, his voice steady and slow. That voice that he used whenever Tom needed help with his homework, whenever he asked the questions about quirks he did not understand. Tom bit his lip, tears forming in his eyes. He dared not to look up, in case this was all but a beautiful dream and looking up would mean he would wake up, all alone. He hated how his parents spoke of the timeline as a god or a higher being, because for almost a year he would hate the timeline for leaving him all alone. He noticed a soft hand come up to him and brush his forehead, pulling away the long bangs away from his eyes, feeling his dry skin. He choked on a sob, his hands gripping the edge of his seat, hearing the sigh of his mother. "My poor baby," she cooed, tilting forward, "you look so exhausted. Have you been sleeping at all?" Her concerned voice was enough for a tear to fall, her eyes noticing the eye bags under her son's eyes and the cheekbones prominent. "Have you been eating?" Tom's vision was blurred by his tears, soon feeling the hand of his father holding his shoulder. Both of his parents' heads tilted down to catch his eyes and make him look up. Tom sobbed louder, leaning into his mother's touch. "Mom," the word that left a lump at the back of his throat, hiccuping. "I was so alone, you were gone." Finally his eyes closed shut, the tears fell down his cheek, his sobs finally set free as he cried for the first time in months. But not from mourning, loss, or numbness. Finally there were happy tears, and more of them poured as his parents stood up quickly, their arms wrapping around the older variant, allowing him to be vulnerable after so long. Their own eyes teared up, realizing how long he must have been going through this torture. The younger variant looked at his parents and his older version, feeling some sort of comfort to see relief on everyone's faces. He stood up himself, only to suddenly feel a grip of his mother on his own wrist and a pull into the hug. He gasped, and felt a little awkward when his body touched the other variants, but eventually he melted in the embrace. They sat like that for a long moment, until essentially they all pulled away, the two sons looking at each other. Their mother smiled and declared, her hands brushing their hair. "Well, you two always wanted brothers, didn't you? I suppose now you will have each other," she smiled, filling the older male's heart. "He will never be alone again. But we do need to change one of your names. I am not calling both of you Tom," she declared with a serious face. Both of the sons looked at each other, shrugging confused to who would have the honor of wearing another name. The father then smiled and held the older one's shoulder. "Well, before you were born, we were thinking of another name. Tobias," he suggested. Not incredibly different, but I think in this circumstance it is the perfect name for you. What do you think? He asked with a smile on his face. The older brother smiled back, feeling inner peace that he was soon to be more comfortable with. Yeah, sounds good. Hey, are you sure you know what you're doing? Asked Tom, following his now older brother through the city. His posture was a little slouched, his steps trying to catch up with his older self. Tom, or rather Tobias, just pushed past people as he walked towards the location he was directed to. His thoughts still circling back to what his parents told him about the final battle and how the world drastically began changing. Not to mention the great sacrifice of Izuku Midoriya. Look, I need to make sure he's okay. Our quirk enables us to contact the traveler unless they contact us. And since I am here rather than in the timeline I came from, I am not going to waste this opportunity. His voice was stern, and his steps grew with urgency. He heard the younger male sigh, catching up to him as he looked up. Even if it had only been a year, Tom had to look up at his older self. A slight difference between them was prominent. How do you know he's better than the rest? The younger male asked. Look, after we helped others, everyone left. They pretended we were crazy or we were making stuff up. How do you know that this time it won't be the same story over again? His eyes searching the ground as he tried his best to not allow his dark thoughts engulf his mind, or the tears to form in his eyes, and be called a cry baby by someone else again. Tobias looked at Tom, the name still a little foreign to him, and yet it was an outcome he never dared to dream of. His hand squeezed the younger one's shoulder, their amber eyes meeting as Tobias explained. Internally, he was incredibly happy to finally have a younger sibling. Because Izuku didn't time travel for himself, he did it for others. He's the most selfless person I know and the most reliable friend I ever. He stopped himself as a feeling of unease washed over him. His lips closed, biting his cheek as Tom tilted his head, confused. Tobias noticed it and straightened his back, patting Tom's as well, remembering the habit he caught on. Tom immediately fixed his posture. Tobias smiled. Come on. You said that the class often sits by that massive tree in the park? His eyes looked around the area, surprised to see it so well looked after. And to think that was where he would have done construction work. Tom nodded, looking around as they reached the destination, matching the one of his older version. Yeah, they should be over there. He pointed with his index finger, his heart hammering as he realized he may have shouted a little too loudly. Tobias looked over at the group of people that stared at him and his younger self with confusion. He felt his cheeks redden, grabbing the other one's pointing hand and slapping it down in embarrassment. Ow! Tom looked flabbergasted, offended at his older version, holding his slapped hand. Don't point. It's rude, he muttered, before Tobias's eyes landed on a brunette with an eye patch who stood up slowly, staring at him with confusion and interest. The two males slowly walked up to the small group of people, the older male's eyes desperately looking around the sea of faces to spot the one he sent there first. Ochako took a step closer to the male with dark long hair. Tom, yes? Her voice sounded a little unsure, her head tilting to the side. Tobias froze mid-step, and so did Tom as they both felt an uneasy shiver go down their spines. However, Tobias felt the guilt rise within him as well. Tom looked confused until he noticed the brown eye of the brunette looking at Tobias for a second longer than him. The older male nodded, the words not coming out of his mouth. He felt the eyes of the other members of 1A soften a little, as if a long-awaited relief washed over them. Midoriya, Izuku here? He asked in an unsure tone. Tom looked at his older version still confused, his eyes flickering between the people before him to try and add up the facts together. Another person stood up from the others. This one, however, had very dark green hair, his green eyes looking at the two brothers, in slight curiosity, tilting his head to the side. Tobias felt his heart stop as he noticed Izuku himself stand up, a smile appearing on his face. He felt relief wash over him. He took a step forward. Izuku, you're okay, but as their eyes met, Tobias felt that something was off. The green eyes were not looking at him with a sense of familiarity, but rather confusion and foreignness. Tobias felt as if his feet were sinking to the ground, his smile dropped as the lump in his throat formed again, the familiar disappointment coming back to him. Tom, right? asked Izuku, an unsure smile forming on his face. Tobias frowned, his eyes looking down as he sighed. He shook his head, a single tear rolling in his eye as it formed. Tobias actually, he muttered, causing others to look at him a little confused. He continued, I had to change my name since, never mind, forgive me for this. He was about to turn around and leave. Tom looked at his older version in sadness and slight desperation, a question still lingering on his mind. If Izuku did not remember who Tom was, then how did the girl he never met in person know? Sure, everyone knew the famous hero Uravity, but wouldn't telling the information prior to the time change cause her to permanently cease to exist? But that was until he felt a hand on his wrist, catching his attention. Tobias noticed Izuku looking at him with a worried expression, as he took out something from his pocket. Tobias's eyes widened as he realized it was the same device that Izuku used to communicate with him. Tobias's eyes lit up, his expression softening as he looked up at the others who stood up from their seated area, looking at the black-haired male. Deku had shown us a recording. It was of him explaining everything in case he would not make it in the battle against the villains. The brunette explained, coming a little closer to the others, her smile not leaving her face. And to be honest, he had only shown it to us a few hours ago. On the recording, he explained that you are the reason he could come to us and try to save us. A male with red hair spoke up, his demeanor cheerful and calm. So if anything, it's also thanks to you, he added, causing Tobias's face to get hotter. Izuku smiled as well, giving the device back to Tom. I don't know if I told you, but apparently as I was reliving the same days, I was slowly losing my memory. Apparently I also predicted that if the plan were to succeed, I would lose my memory. He explained, his green eyes focused solemnly on Tobias and glancing back at his younger version who was now hovering close to his older brother. Tobias, at the realization, felt his whole face turn hot from embarrassment, but also as if a tidal wave hit him right in the face. He grabbed his own face and stared blankly. His quirk had a side defect this whole time. He felt shame as he realized that all those encounters were not a mockery facade, but rather others genuinely not remembering who he was in the first place. Their weirded stares, their sarcastic smiles which were actually to cover up the confusion rather than mockery that he initially took in. Changing time must have altered their memories as well. Tom stood next to Tobias, his mind going through a mental analysis as well. Uraraka suddenly placed her hands on both of the male's shoulders. Do you guys want to stay with us for a while? Seems we all have a lot to catch up on. She smiled invitingly at the two, her head tilting to the side as if to point at the others who shared the same expression as her. Tobias looked over at his younger version, a little smile appearing on his face as he took a deep breath, signifying the start of a new chapter in both of their lives. Now they did not only have each other, but also people around them who seemed to be more than welcoming to new members of their friendship cycle. Tom, however, began feeling a sense of happiness which he was always so distant from. But he was more than happy to embrace this new life, step into the world where he was not only classified by his quirk. He was seen as a person, as an individual, as a friend.